Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I've always been a night person. There's something about the stillness of the dark hours, the way everything slows down, that suits me. So when I started working the graveyard shift at Holloway Auto Salvage, it wasn't a big deal. Most people would have been freaked out by the idea of spending the entire night alone in a sprawling junkyard on the outskirts of Black Hollow, Tennessee. But me? I liked the quiet. The air was always cool, even in the dead of summer, and the low hum of traffic on the highway in the distance kept me company. Holloway Auto Salvage wasn't like the clean, organized salvage yards you see in the city. This place was a maze of rusted-out cars and wrecks stacked on top of each other like some twisted monument to the past. The yard lights flickered half the time, casting eerie shadows across the oil-stained concrete. A lot of the cars were old, the kinds you couldn't sell anymore, just sitting there waiting to be stripped for parts or left to rot. The worst part of the yard, the part I dreaded the most, was the dead lot. The dead lot was where the unsalvageable cars were dumped. You could see the crumpled, mangled remains of vehicles, old sedans with crushed roofs, trucks bent in half from rollovers, and cars that looked like they'd been twisted in some kind of metal hell. I hated going out there at night. The shadows seemed to cling to the wreckage, and there was always a coldness in the air, even when it was warm outside. The first night I noticed the flickering lights, I didn't think much of it. The wiring out here was old and the bulbs were cheap. I'd seen worse at other places, but these lights, they didn't flicker like normal. They pulsed. Sometimes they'd flare up so bright it felt like a camera flash, then die down to nothing. And not always in a regular pattern either. One minute they'd be fine, and the next they'd blink like a strobe light, lighting up the yard in flashes. At first I assumed it was just the power acting up. Maybe some rodent had chewed through the wires, or it was just the old circuits being unreliable. But the more I watched them, the more unsettling it became. The lights in the dead lot always seemed to flicker longer than anywhere else. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night I took a walk over to the dead lot to check the lights out. That's when I noticed the sedan. It was an old '89 Chevy Caprice, stripped down to its bones, but there was something strange about it. It had this pale blue glow coming from the interior, like some kind of ghostly light emanating from within. I moved closer, my boots crunching over the gravel. The closer I got, the more intense the glow became, almost like it was pulsing with life. But as soon as I stepped up to the car, the glow vanished. I shined my flashlight inside, but the interior was just as empty as it had been before. Still, the smell hit me, a sharp, burnt smell like hair that had been singed. I didn't know why, but that smell made my skin crawl. It was the kind of smell you associate with something wrong. I quickly backed away, my pulse racing. I told myself it was just the metal catching the light in some weird way, or maybe a reflection from the yard lights. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that car had been trying to get my attention. The whole place seemed off that night. I couldn't help but feel that the junkyard wasn't just a place for discarded cars. It was a graveyard for something else entirely. Something was wrong at Holloway. And I had a feeling it wasn't just the lights. The next few nights, the flickering lights were a constant presence, more unnerving than anything else. I'd gotten used to the erratic flashes by now, though they still made me uneasy. At first I figured I was just letting my mind run wild. After all, it was easy to get lost in the quiet and isolation of the junkyard at night. But this place, it felt different, and that damn Chevy Caprice was always on my mind. I'd noticed other things too, little oddities that didn't make sense at first but began to pile up. For example, one evening, while I was doing my rounds near the far end of the lot, I heard a tapping sound coming from the wreck of a Ford pickup. It wasn't the sound of metal settling or the wind making noise. It was deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, listening. It was coming from the inside of the cab. The kind of sound you'd expect if someone were tapping their finger on the window or knocking on the door. The more I listened, the more the tapping seemed to match the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Just an animal, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling that was creeping up my spine. But when I shined my flashlight into the pickup's cab, there was nothing, just emptiness. The tap stopped as soon as the light hit the dark interior. I stood there for a moment, wondering if maybe a rat had gotten inside and was banging around. But no, that didn't feel right. The air was still. Too still. I moved on, trying to dismiss the feeling of unease crawling up my back. But the longer I worked the graveyard shift, the harder it became to shake off. The whispers. They started, next. I was sitting in the office staring at the monitors when I heard the first faint static on the radio. The crackling wasn't unusual. This place had terrible reception. But this was different. It wasn't just static. There were voices in the background. Soft, like they were too far away to make out, but close enough to send a chill down my spine. I leaned forward in my chair, straining to hear. The radio crackled again, then a voice came through clearly. A woman's voice, but it was muffled, like she was speaking from behind a wall. "Get out!" The words sent a jolt through me. The static cut off abruptly, and the radio returned to its usual hiss. I sat there, frozen, staring at the radio in disbelief. My stomach twisted into knots, and I felt the hairs on my neck rise. Who was that? And how had she gotten through the radio? I tried to brush it off. It was late, I was tired, and the mind starts playing tricks when you're alone in a place like this. But the words stayed with me. "Get out." The whispers returned, several times after that, always in the dead of night. Sometimes they were clearer than others, but always soft, like they were coming from somewhere deep inside the yard. Other times it sounded like they were coming through the walls of the office. The whole place seemed to be pressing in on me, like the walls of metal and junk were alive, watching me. I kept telling myself it was just the stress getting to me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. One night I heard a sound I couldn't ignore. It was the Pontiac, an old rusted thing that had been sitting for years, long past the point where anyone would have tried to fix it. The car's trunk was wedged shut. The latch rusted tight, but at exactly 2:17 a.m. I saw it on the monitor. The trunk popped open, slowly, almost as if someone was doing it by hand. The moment I saw it, I grabbed the keys and rushed outside. When I got to the Pontiac, the trunk was wide open, the cold air making my breath hang in front of me in little clouds. But the inside was empty. Nothing inside, not even a stray piece of trash. But when I reached for the latch to close it, my fingers brushed against it and the metal was freezing. I jumped back, shaking my hand as though I'd touched something that burned. What the hell? I checked the trunk again. Nothing. But that freezing chill lingered. Like it had been left there on purpose, it was becoming harder to explain everything away. The tapping, the whispers, the freezing trunk. It felt like I was being watched. I tried to rationalize it. The mind plays tricks when you're isolated, I told myself. But the unease was growing. And then, just when I thought I'd seen everything, there was to see. Something happened that took it all to the next level. I heard footsteps. It wasn't the sound of my own boots on gravel or an animal moving around. No, these steps were deliberate, pacing behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped too. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the yard was empty. The pale glow of the yard lights stretched across the tangled wreckage of cars, casting long, twisted shadows across the gravel. There was no one there. But I wasn't alone. A fresh, perfect handprint was pressed into the hood of a car nearby, its edges sharp and clear. My heart raced. I took a step back, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Someone, or something, was out there. I wasn't crazy, and it wasn't just the lights flickering anymore. It was more than that. The whole yard was haunted, a place full of restless spirits, or worse. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, but one thing was clear. Holloway Auto Salvage wasn't a place to work alone at night. By the time I'd come to grips with the fact that something was seriously wrong at Holloway Auto Salvage, I was already too deep into the job to walk away. Not yet, at least. I kept telling myself I was just imagining things. The tapping, the whispers, the handprint, they were all coincidences. Maybe the stress was getting to me. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But there was something about this place, something I couldn't shake, that gnawed at me every night. I still remember the night the wrench fell. It was an ordinary night, or at least I tried to convince myself it was. I had just finished my rounds, checking in on the main lot and making sure the gates were locked. The last part of my shift was always the dead lot, the farthest end of the salvage yard, where we piled up the most beaten-up and irreparable cars. It was a desolate place even in the daylight, the wrecked frames and shattered glass half buried in tall grass and overgrown weeds. The eerie feeling that hung over the lot only seemed to grow when night settled in. The air was thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the sense that I wasn't alone lingering in the air. But it wasn't just the darkness that made it feel wrong. It was the heaviness. Like something was watching me. I'd already started to move toward the far corner, where an old Chevy was perched on a stack of rusted bumpers. As I passed a Ford truck, I heard a sharp metallic clink, like a wrench hitting the concrete. I froze listening, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. The whole yard was still, save for the gentle rustling of the wind through the scattered piles of scrap metal. I turned my flashlight in the direction of the noise, and my heart skipped a beat. There it was, a socket wrench lying on the ground right next to the truck. It was exactly where I had just been a few minutes earlier, checking the tires on another car. But I hadn't dropped anything. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The wrench was cold, colder than it had any right to be, especially on a night that wasn't all that chilly. I bent down to pick it up, but as soon as my fingers brushed the metal, I felt a jolt of ice run up my arm. It was like touching a block of frozen steel. I yanked my hand back, my breath shallow. Okay, that's not normal, I muttered under my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stared at the wrench again, but there was nothing unusual about it. No explanation for why it had dropped. It was just an ordinary tool, an ordinary cold, too cold tool. For a second I thought about going to get a supervisor or at least calling someone. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was ridiculous, right? I was a grown man, not some superstitious kid afraid of the dark. But the problem wasn't just the wrench, it was the way I felt. Like I was being pushed closer and closer to the edge of something I didn't understand. I shoved the wrench into my tool belt, thinking maybe I should just get the hell out of the dead lot and finish my shift somewhere less unsettling. But as I turned to walk back toward the main lot, the silence pressed in on me. It was like the sound of the gravel under my boots had been swallowed up by the darkness, and suddenly, it was just me and whatever else was in the yard with me. The radio crackled in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. At first it was just the usual hiss of static, but then I heard a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Help. The voice was a rasp, like someone was struggling to speak through a dry throat. My chest tightened. I froze. "Who's there?" I asked, but the radio only responded with a burst of static. The whisper had sounded close, too close. I pressed the radio to my ear, listening for any other sounds. Nothing, just static. My mind raced. Could someone else be out here with me? Maybe someone had gotten into the yard, or worse, maybe someone had been trapped in one of the cars. But when I looked around, there was no one. The yard was still. No movement, no sign of life, just the faint flickering of the overhead lights. I kept walking, trying to ignore the tension building in my stomach. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the yard had turned against me. The air felt colder now, thicker somehow. As I reached the end of the lot, the worst happened. The lights went out. 1 minute they were flickering, but still on. The next minute, the whole yard was plunged into darkness. My flashlight sputtered, its beam cutting through the black void in front of me. "God damn it," I muttered, shaking the flashlight, trying to get it to work. But the light was dim, weaker than usual, like it was barely holding on. I felt my pulse race, and every instinct in my body told me to get back to the office, to lock the doors and never come back. But before I could even turn around, I heard the car engine. The sound of a single headlight flickering to life in the distance. I turned, heart in my throat, as the light cut through the blackness. It wasn't the flickering of the yard lights. It was the glow of a headlight, steady and bright. And right next to it, standing by the old '89 Chevy Caprice, was a figure. A tall, skeletal figure. Its body was stretched too thin, too long. The fingers curled like claws, its face stretched out in a grotesque mask. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. I couldn't see its face clearly, only the silhouette, the way the light seemed to distort its shape. I froze. Then, without warning, the figure took a slow step forward. The ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate, and the radio in my pocket screeched with static, louder than it had ever been before. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the office. My flashlight flickered out completely, and the darkness swallowed me whole. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled toward the door. I slammed it shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. For the rest of the night, I sat in the office, the walls closing in around me, the silence so thick I could barely hear myself think. The next morning, when the daylight finally broke over the junkyard, I went back to check the dead lot. There was nothing there. The Chevy Caprice sat as it always had, rusting and abandoned. No figure, no sign of anything unusual. But I knew what I'd seen, I knew what I'd felt, and I was done. I couldn't keep pretending. There was something wrong with this place. Something I didn't understand. Something I couldn't escape. The wrench, the whispers, the figure in the dead lot. They were all signs, and they had made it clear that Holloway Auto Salvage wasn't just an ordinary junkyard. It was a place haunted by something that refused to let go. And I didn't plan on sticking around long enough to find out what. The morning after the night I ran from the dead lot, I felt like I'd left part of myself behind. I didn't know what it was that made me come back to Holloway Auto Salvage that day. Maybe it was habit, or maybe I was just too proud to let fear dictate my life. Whatever the reason, I went back to the yard that day like it was any other. But I wasn't the same. The air had a different weight to it, a heaviness I couldn't shake. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen, its skeletal, distorted body standing by that Chevy. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. It was like I'd walked into a dream I couldn't wake up from. But I had to work, right? People depended on me. I couldn't let this place break me. I got to the yard just before the sun rose. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. The usual sounds of the birds and the faint hum of the highway were gone. It was like the world had pressed pause. Even the wind felt wrong. Still, like it was holding its breath. I parked my truck at the entrance and got out, my boots crunching against the gravel. My mind wasn't exactly clear, but I had a job to do. I had to check the perimeter, do my rounds, make sure everything was locked up. The place was deserted, save for the few old cars scattered across the lot, waiting for parts to be salvaged or to be crushed into scrap. As I made my way toward the main lot, I could feel the weight of the place on me, like it was pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I couldn't help but glance toward the dead lot, the far corner of the yard where everything had gone to hell the night before. The light from the security lamps flickered on and off as I walked past. I had grown used to the dim, unreliable glow, but today it seemed more erratic, like it was trying to warn me. "Come on, get it together," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. But the unease in my gut only grew stronger. I walked over to the small shed that housed the tools and keys. I grabbed the broom to sweep around the office and decided to tackle the east end of the lot. A stretch of cars piled high with their hoods open and parts strewn across the ground. My hands gripped the broom handle a little too tight as I pushed. Through the rows of cars, the light from the flickering bulbs casting long, shifting shadows across the yard. But as I neared a beat-up Nissan, something caught my eye. A set of fresh footprints in the gravel, leading right toward the abandoned cars. It wasn't possible. I was alone. I knew I was. No one else was supposed to be here at this hour. My heart rate quickened. I stopped in my tracks and looked around, but the lot was still. Too still. I bent down, my knees creaking as I knelt to get a closer look. The footprints were deep, like someone had been walking through the gravel just moments before. They weren't there when I arrived, and they weren't mine. The prints led toward the crushed sedan at the far edge of the lot. I hesitated, staring at them, but curiosity overpowered my better judgment. Maybe someone had snuck in, or maybe this was some weird prank. It had to be. There was no other explanation. I followed the tracks slowly, keeping my senses alert. Every instinct in me told me to turn around and walk back to the office, but I couldn't shake the need to know what was going on. The footsteps were too real, too fresh. They weren't fading into the gravel the way they should have been. They were sharp, clear, and undeniable. As I approached the car, the silence around me seemed to thicken. The air was still, but the hairs on my neck were standing up, a faint tingling creeping down my spine. The silence was broken only by the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel. Then, without warning, I heard it. Footsteps. A slow, deliberate crunch, crunch, crunch in, the gravel matching my pace perfectly. I froze. My stomach dropped. I turned quickly, heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The yard stretched out behind me, empty, the shadows from the cars hanging low in the early morning light. I was alone. At least that's what I thought. But the footsteps kept going, steady and rhythmic, like they were right behind me. I spun around again, faster this time, but I saw nothing, nothing at all. The lot was empty, completely still. My pulse was hammering in my ears, my breath coming faster now as I stumbled back a few steps. I held the broom in front of me like it was a weapon, though I knew how ridiculous I must have looked. The footsteps behind me stopped. The eerie silence returned, the oppressive quiet hanging in the air. I didn't know what was happening, but my instincts screamed at me to get the hell out of there. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned and ran toward the office, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my feet, but I didn't dare look back. I could still hear the steps behind me, but I refused to turn around. The sound was there, but it didn't fade. It followed me, matching my pace step for step. When I reached the office, I slammed the door shut behind me, breathing hard, my head spinning. My hands were shaking, my grip tight on the broom as if it could somehow protect me from whatever was happening. I stayed inside for the rest of the morning, not daring to go back out. The steps, the fresh footprints in the gravel, were undeniable. And the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time, that it was somehow always there, never left. By the time my shift ended, the sun was fully up, casting light on the yard. Everything looked normal again, too normal. The footprints were gone, the footsteps had stopped, and the air seemed to have lightened. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what had happened. And I knew I couldn't keep pretending that I was just imagining it. I didn't know who or what was in that yard, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The thing I hadn't told anyone was that, as I left the yard that morning, I saw something, or rather, someone, standing in the dead lot. It was the same figure I had seen the night before, standing next to the Chevy Caprice, bathed in the faint light from the far-off lamp. It was watching me. And this time, it wasn't alone. The days after the encounter in the dead lot were a blur. I couldn't shake the image of the skeletal figure. It lingered in the back of my mind, taking root in my thoughts like a thorn. It was hard to tell if it was fear, exhaustion, or just the weight of working graveyard shifts for so long. But whatever it was, it consumed me. I'd been working the night shifts at Holloway Auto Salvage for months. The hours were long, the nights quiet, and I was used to the isolation. But the quiet was different now. It felt heavy, like the air itself had turned stale, and every sound in the yard seemed to echo back to me with an unnatural weight. I tried to brush off what had happened. I tried to convince myself it was just the stress. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I didn't want to believe that there was something truly wrong with the yard, but no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the truth kept creeping back in. And so did the noises. It started small, a tap here, a thud there. It was like a forgotten car was trying to communicate with me. Or maybe it was the remnants of whatever lingered in that yard, trying to reach out. One night, as I was walking past a Ford pickup that had been crushed beyond recognition, I heard it again. A tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, like someone was tapping a finger against metal trying to get my attention. I froze in place, staring at the wreckage. My flashlight flickered and buzzed in my hand as if the batteries were fighting against whatever energy lingered there. I shone the light inside the truck's cab, but there was nothing. Empty. Just a rusted-out shell with no sign of life. No explanation for the tapping sound. I shook it off and continued with my rounds, trying to keep my mind occupied. But as I walked back to the main office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the distance, watching me. As I entered the office to check the security footage, I heard the faintest sound over the radio. At first, it was just static. Then it came again, like a voice, muffled, barely audible but distinct enough that my skin crawled. "Get out," it whispered. A woman's voice. Then the static cut out. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things or if the radio was just malfunctioning, but it didn't feel like it. It felt real. Too real. I tried to push through the fear, thinking it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But that night, things escalated. At 2:17 a.m., the monitors in the office flickered to life. I watched as a rusted Pontiac's trunk popped open on its own. The latch was stiff, old, and should have been stuck, but it opened with a creak that echoed across the yard. I grabbed my flashlight, my pulse quickening. When I reached the Pontiac, the trunk was empty, just as I expected. But the latch, it was ice cold to the touch, colder than the night air had any right to be. It sent a chill up my spine, and I couldn't get away from it fast enough. Just as I was about to turn and head back to the office, I heard something. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, the crunching of gravel behind me. My heart slammed in my chest as I spun around expecting to see someone there, but the yard was empty. The gravel was undisturbed, the night still and quiet. Except for one thing. A handprint, fresh, slick with condensation, marked the hood of a nearby car. I approached slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The print was large, too large to be from my own hand, and it looked like it had just been left there, as if someone had placed their palm on the hood just moments before. My breathing came in shallow bursts. Suddenly, a metallic clatter sounded from behind me. I turned to see the socket wrench, the one I had left on the toolbox earlier, clattering to the ground as though dropped by an invisible hand. It hit the concrete with a hollow clang, the sound reverberating in the dead silence of the yard. I reached down to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The wrench was freezing. It was as if it had been outside in sub-zero temperatures for hours, yet it hadn't even been that cold. That's when everything stopped. I couldn't explain it. The yard, the lights, the sounds, everything just went silent. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then in the distance I saw it, a headlight flaring to life. The familiar glow of the '89 Chevy Caprice. Only this time, it wasn't just a car. There, in the beam of the light, stood the figure, tall, skeletal, its face stretched and twisted, its fingers curled like rusted hooks. The figure's dark, empty eyes locked onto mine, and my body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It took one step forward, and the radio in my pocket screamed with static, loud and sharp. It felt like the entire yard was closing in around me. Without thinking, I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, my feet slapping against the gravel. I didn't stop until I was inside the garage, slamming the door shut behind me. I could still feel the weight of the thing's gaze on me, even from the safety of the building. The next morning, when I went to check the security footage, there was nothing. Just me running from an empty yard. No figure, no light. It was as if everything had been erased. I quit that day. I didn't care about the owner's scoffs or the empty promises of nothing to worry about. I couldn't go back. The guys who worked the day shift whispered about the yard's past, that a mechanic had died here years ago, crushed under a car that slipped its jack. They said his tools still moved on their own. Now every time I drive past Holloway Auto Salvage at night, I swear I see a single headlight flicker to life in the dead lot. And even though I'm miles away, I can't shake the feeling that something's still watching, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, when I drive by late at night, I hear it, a faint clattering of metal in the distance. It's as if it's calling me back. I've been working the night shift at Blackwood Tower for nearly 6 months now, long enough to get used to the quiet routine. I'm Elias Carter, a janitor. Nothing glamorous. Just a guy who sweeps and mops, takes out the trash, and makes sure the building's spotless for when the regular tenants start their day. It's not the best job, but it's steady, and that's enough for me. Blackwood Tower itself is an impressive building. Modern, sleek, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a view of the mountains in the distance. It stands at the edge of Ravenshade, Vermont, a town that's small enough to feel isolated but big enough to have a little history. The tower was supposed to be a beacon for the future, a symbol of progress. But the people who designed it clearly forgot one important detail. The place feels wrong. There's a weight to it, something you can't quite put your finger on, but it's there, lurking. I didn't notice it at first. When I first started, I figured it was just another big, empty building, mostly still under construction, which is why there were only a few tenants on the lower floors. The place was almost like a giant skeleton, half-finished, with exposed wires and dry-walled frames that made it feel more like a set for a horror movie than a modern office building. But then there's the 23rd floor. It's been closed off for as long as I've been here. The doors are locked and the hallways are nothing more than a mess of plastic sheeting and disassembled construction equipment. There's a rumor about the floor, though. An old story that gets whispered between the night workers when they think no one's listening. Apparently, a worker fell during the initial construction phase, somewhere between the 22nd and 23rd floors. The story goes that his body was never found. They say the accident was just that, an accident. But when you walk past the floor, there's a weird kind of energy that makes you feel like there's something unfinished, or maybe something still waiting. My rounds are always quiet except for that floor. It's like the air thickens as soon as I step onto the landing for the 23rd. I can't explain it. The whole floor just feels colder, despite the heating being on. The lights flicker when I walk past. It's nothing major, just a little stutter. But it's enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious about what was on the 23rd floor. There's no way around it. No matter how hard I try to avoid it, my eyes always seem to be drawn to the hallway beyond the barricade, the one that leads to the elevator and the unfinished rooms. I've often wondered if I might peek in one night, just to see for myself. But then I think about the stories and the way the others avoid the floor altogether. I tell myself it's better to just stick to my usual rounds. The rest of the building is a maze of empty office spaces, quiet, but normal, except for that one place. I started out my first night at Blackwood Tower thinking I could ignore it, push it to the back of my mind. I was going to do my job and go home like I always did. But there was something about the 23rd floor, something that pulled me toward it like a magnet. That's the problem with places like this, isn't it? It's not the building that's wrong. It's the way it makes you feel like you're being watched, like you're not supposed to be there. It's the kind of place that sticks in your head long after you leave. As I made my way through the building that night, my flashlight bounced off the dusty walls of the 23rd floor. The shadows were longer than usual, stretching into places they shouldn't. The plastic sheeting fluttered slightly even though there wasn't any air movement. I was almost too tired to care, but something told me I should hurry up and get this part of my rounds done. That was the first time I saw it. The glass partition near the east stairwell. I saw a tall figure. At first I thought it was just a reflection of me, some trick of the light. But when I turned around, I was alone. There was no one behind me, no one near the windows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen someone. Something, standing, there. I've been working nights for a long time, and I've learned not to panic over little things. It could have been a shadow, a trick of the light. But there was something about it that didn't sit right. I had a feeling that I was being watched, and the feeling didn't go away. That night was quiet. Too quiet. The rest of the building was still, except for the odd squeak of the elevator and the faint hum of the air conditioning. But I couldn't shake the unease that had crept over me when I was on that floor. It stayed with me, gnawing at my mind, as I continued my rounds. When I finally finished, I made my way to the elevator. I pushed the button, and as the doors opened with their usual smoothness, I couldn't help but glance back toward the 23rd floor. That hallway, that unfinished space. I don't know why, but I felt like it was waiting for me to come back. And that's exactly what I did. I couldn't get the 23rd floor out of my head. I had made a habit of trying to ignore it, of pretending like it didn't exist. But as the days dragged on, that creeping sense of unease kept sneaking into my thoughts, especially during my late-night shifts. It was as if the building itself was whispering to me, subtle at first, then louder with each passing night. The second night after the incident with the shadow, I decided to stick to my usual routine. I told myself it was just a flicker of light, nothing more. But deep down, I knew there was something off about the place. Every time I walked past the 23rd floor, I could feel the temperature drop a few degrees, like I was walking into an open freezer. My breath would cloud in the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up straight, as if someone was breathing down my neck. And I would always quicken my pace, get out of there as fast as I could. That night, though, was different. The building was quieter than usual, and I found myself growing more and more aware of every creak and groan as I made my rounds. The fluorescent lights flickered in the halls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. As I reached the 23rd floor, the unsettling cold gripped the hallway like a vice. The plastic sheeting that draped over the half-constructed walls rustled gently in the still air, but it wasn't the only thing that moved. My flashlight flickered again more than usual. I slapped it once or twice, but it didn't do much. The beam seemed to shrink, almost as if it didn't want to, illuminate the space ahead of me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I told myself to just do my job and keep moving. I had gotten used to the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the empty halls, until that night. It was just after midnight when it happened. I was near the east stairwell, mopping the floor in one of the half-finished office spaces. The rhythmic swish of the mop was the only sound in the building, other than the distant hum of the HVAC system. But then I heard it. At first it was faint, a soft thud, the sound of footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. I stopped, my mop frozen mid-swipe, straining to listen. It was slow at first, deliberate, almost like the sound of someone walking, in sync with me. I turned, looking toward the stairwell. Empty. I tried to dismiss it. There was no one else working that night, and the building was mostly empty anyway. But as I started mopping again, the footsteps came again, clearer this time, matching the sound of my own movements. My heart began to race. It felt like someone was walking right behind me, step for step. I stopped again. The footsteps continued. A chill washed over me. I'd heard of people experiencing strange sounds in empty buildings before, but this was different. It wasn't just noise. It was deliberate, intentional. It was like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I backed up slowly, still holding the mop, my flashlight swinging wildly as I turned to face the direction of the sound. But as soon as I stopped moving, the footsteps stopped too. The building fell silent again, so still that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, waiting for the footsteps to start again. But they didn't. I took a few tentative steps toward the stairwell, cautiously checking behind me as I went. Nothing. The floor was empty, still, and silent. It was ridiculous, I told myself. There was nothing there. Just the building settling, the old creaks of a structure that had been under construction for months. But as I turned back to finish mopping, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was standing just out of sight waiting. I rushed through the rest of my cleaning. The quicker I finished, the sooner I could leave. But as I neared the elevators, I heard it again. The same soft, deliberate steps following mine, but this time from the hallway. Behind me, I whirled around, but the hallway was empty. There wasn't even a breeze to disturb the dust on the floor. It was just me, alone. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I felt the cold air closing in on me. My flashlight flickered again, and I swear I saw something move just beyond the beam, a shape tall and thin standing in the corner of the room near the windows. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted for the elevator, pressing the button frantically. The doors opened almost immediately, and I stepped inside. But the moment the doors closed, I felt a chill that sent a shiver down my spine. Something was wrong. Something was watching me, even as I stood there alone in the elevator. The elevator creaked as it began its slow descent to the ground floor. The lights above flickered, and for a split second, the building seemed to shift, as though the walls were closing in on me. The reflection of my own face in the elevator's polished metal doors seemed distorted, like I was staring at someone else, someone I didn't recognize. The elevator came to a halt, and the doors opened with a soft ding. I didn't waste any time. I stepped out and practically ran to the exit. When I reached the doors of Blackwood Tower, the cold air outside hit me like a slap in the face. But it didn't help. The chill that had settled in my bones stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind, reminding me of the things I'd seen, or thought I saw, on the 23rd floor. I kept telling myself it was nothing. The building was new. Things were bound to happen in a structure like that. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was more than just a flicker of a shadow or the sound of footsteps. Something was in that building, something that didn't belong, and it was waiting for me to come back. I didn't want to go back to Blackwood Tower. The thought of returning to the 23rd floor made my stomach turn, and every time I thought about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still waiting for me in that empty, unfinished space. But the thing about being a night shift janitor is that no matter how terrified you are, you don't have much of a choice. The hours are long, the pay is decent, and no one else will take the graveyard shift. So I went back. The building had a different atmosphere that night. The usual silence was broken by the faint hum of the air conditioning, and the fluorescent lights buzzed more than usual. I was on edge the second I stepped into the lobby, but I had a job to do. And as I rode the elevator up to the 23rd floor, I forced myself to breathe evenly, to tell myself that this was just another night. When the doors opened on the 23rd floor, I immediately felt that familiar drop in temperature, the coldness seeping into my bones like a physical presence. I quickly made my way down the hallway, past the exposed drywall frames, the plastic sheeting flapping in the air like something alive, always moving just out of the corner of my eye. The faint light from my flashlight cast long, jittery shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally as I moved. I tried to focus on my work, sweeping up dust, wiping down the odd bits of debris, but every time my eyes wandered toward the far end of the floor, near the windows, I felt that sense of wrongness crawl up my spine. Something was there. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I saw it. At first, it was just a silhouette in the corner of my vision, a tall, thin figure standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city below. The figure was unnaturally still, its long limbs nearly hidden by the darkness of the night outside, its head slightly tilted to the side. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the framework of the unfinished building. But then it moved. Or rather, it didn't. I stopped what I was doing. My heart began to thud loudly in my chest, and I tried to steady my breathing. Maybe I was just tired, maybe I was imagining things. I had been working the night shift for months now, and I knew how easy it was to slip into a state of half-awake paranoia. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring out the window. Its limbs were unnaturally long, almost grotesquely so. The faint glow from the distant city lights caught the sharp angles of its arms, giving the illusion that it was taller than any human should be. I took a step closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and then something in me snapped. The air felt thicker, colder. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn and run, but something, maybe just the morbid curiosity that comes with fear, kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Then, just as I brought my flashlight beam up to the figure, it vanished. The light hit nothing but empty space. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Still nothing. No tall, thin figure standing by the window. No trace of it at all. For a second, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on my mind. But I wasn't so sure. I started walking toward the window, my breath coming in shallow bursts, my feet dragging through the thick dust on the floor. My flashlight swept over the empty space as I approached, and I tried to keep my movement steady, calm. I didn't want to freak myself out more than I already was. When I reached the spot where the figure had been standing, I found something strange. There on the floor near the base of the window were small, thin impressions in the dust. They were barely noticeable, almost as if something or someone had been standing there but had only just recently moved away. I knelt down to get a better look. The dust was disturbed in a way that didn't look natural. It wasn't just a footprint, it was something more, like a trail left by a creature whose feet never quite touched the ground. The markings were thin, elongated, like the footprints of something far too tall to fit within the dimensions of the window frame. A chill crawled down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though I wasn't alone on that floor anymore. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone, or something, is watching you, but you can't see them. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, and glanced nervously at the darkened corners of the room. "Just finish your rounds and get out," I muttered under my breath. I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince myself, or if I was trying to remind the building that I was still in. Control. I turned back to the hallway, trying to shake off the feeling of being followed. But when I walked past the window again, I stopped dead in my tracks. For just a second, I could have sworn I saw a reflection in the glass, a tall, hunched shape standing behind me. I whipped around, my heart skipping a beat, but the hallway behind me was empty. No one there. The reflection was gone. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. I wasn't sure what was worse. The idea that I was losing my mind, or the realization that something real, was out there, lurking in the dark corners of Blackwood Tower, waiting for me to return. I shook my head, not trusting my own thoughts. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. I tried to steady my nerves, but I knew, deep down, that I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something in this building, and whatever it was not going to leave me alone. The night after the figure by the window, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its elongated limbs and twisted silhouette, standing motionless by the glass. It felt like I wasn't just cleaning the building anymore. I was trapped in it, trapped by whatever haunted the 23rd floor. The thought gnawed at me all day, but I had no choice but to return. The bills had to be paid, and the building didn't care about my fears. When I arrived at Blackwood Tower, the lobby was quiet as usual, save for the soft hum of the security cameras scanning every corner. The whole place felt sterile, lifeless, like it was too perfect to be real. The floors gleamed under the harsh lights, and the windows reflected an empty world beyond. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime as I stepped in, and I felt the familiar chill settle in around me. The 23rd floor was waiting. I don't know why, but that night, the air felt even colder. Maybe it was the weight of what had happened the night before, or maybe I was just paranoid, but it felt different from all the other nights I'd been there. As I stepped off the elevator and onto the 23rd floor, I noticed something immediately. The door to the east stairwell was slightly ajar, creaking softly as if it had been disturbed. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I was certain I'd closed it behind me the night before. But tonight it was open just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness beyond it. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just another quirk of an unfinished building. The stairwells were always drafty, always making strange noises. I tried to ignore it and focused on my cleaning, but the unease was creeping back into my bones, making it harder to ignore. My flashlight flickered in my hand, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds. My thoughts were racing, mostly about the tall figure I had seen last night. But there was something else now, something subtle. The building felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I started sweeping near the east side of the floor, where the windows stretched from the ceiling to the floor. As I worked, I tried to block out the sound of the creaking door, but it was impossible to concentrate with it constantly reminding me that something was off. I had just finished up the last corner when I noticed something strange in the dust. Fresh footprints. At first I thought they were just mine. Maybe I'd walked through the dust in my shoes without realizing it. But as I leaned in closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints weren't the normal print of a work boot. They were different, bare. And the strange thing was they were in pairs leading to the window. One set of prints, then another and another. They looked like someone, or something, had been walking around the room in the dead of night, leaving behind a trail. I stood frozen, staring at the tracks. They were clear enough that there was no mistaking them. They were new, too recent, to be from anyone who'd come before me. The edges of the prints were sharp, etched into the dust as though the person had been walking through it only moments ago. They led straight to the window, just like the figure from last night. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing thoughts. This was ridiculous, I told myself. It had to be a trick of the light, a fluke. Maybe it was just someone from the construction crew who had wandered through earlier that day. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The prints were too perfect, too deliberate. I followed the trail with my flashlight, moving slowly, trying to steady my breathing. The dust was thick enough that I could feel it sticking to the soles of my boots, but the footprints were still visible, as if someone had been walking slowly, methodically, across the floor. I knelt down to examine them more closely, feeling the cold air around me grow heavier. Each print seemed to sink into the floor as if the person who had made them hadn't touched the ground fully, like they were hovering just above it. I traced the path with my eyes. The print stopped at the window, right where I had seen the figure the night before. The way the dust had settled in the tracks, there was no doubt in my mind that whatever had made them had been there recently, very recently. The thought made my stomach churn. I looked up at the window, but I couldn't see anything. The glass was clear and the city lights flickered in the distance, the same as always. But something about it didn't feel right. I had a nagging sensation that I wasn't alone in that room anymore. That I hadn't been alone for some time. I didn't want to look any closer. I had a feeling that if I did, I'd see something that I wouldn't be able to explain. So I stood up quickly and turned to move away from the window. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the hum of the building's air system. It was a whisper, but it wasn't just any whisper. It was a rasping voice, harsh and jagged, as though it were scraping against the walls of my mind. It felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The whisper was close, too close. You're not supposed to be here. The words froze me in place. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, scanning the room for the source. My flashlight shook in my hand, casting erratic shadows along the walls, but there was nothing. No one. I felt a cold sweat break out along my neck. The whisper had been so clear, so real. I couldn't deny it. It had come from within the walls. I stepped back, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but everything inside me screamed to leave. to get out of that building as fast as I could. But I couldn't. I had to finish my rounds. If I left, I'd have to come back tomorrow, and the thought of facing whatever this was again made me feel even more trapped. But the whispers had already started again. This time, there were more of them. Voices, distant but distinct, like a chorus of people speaking at once, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. I was about to move away from the window when something stopped me. The faintest sound, barely perceptible, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the hallway. Nothing. No one. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, echoing in the distance, matching the rhythm of my own. I didn't stay to find out who or what was following me. I didn't know what it was about that floor, but the air on the 23rd was suffocating, like it was holding something back. I tried to keep my composure, tried to tell myself that everything was fine, that I had imagined the voices and the footsteps. But when I reached for my mop bucket in the corner, I couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl up my spine. I had been walking in circles for an hour, sweeping and mopping the same stretches of hallway over and over, but it didn't matter. The unease was thick, like the building itself was breathing, exhaling a dark, oppressive presence with every creak and groan of its bones. The whispers hadn't stopped either. At first, I thought they were just the wind, or maybe the buildings, old pipes doing what they always did, making strange noises. But tonight there was something different. A hum in the walls, a tremor in the air. As I moved past the skeletal remains of the offices, something felt off. Something more than just the building's unfinished state. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I froze, staring at the space in front of me. The hallway. Ahead was empty, but the shadows twisted unnaturally, pooling like liquid ink in the corners. I had seen the same empty space countless times, but tonight it felt alive, watching me, waiting. I glanced down at the mop bucket, then over my shoulder, and there it was again, soft, deliberate footsteps behind me. The same slow rhythm, the same echo of movement just out of sync with mine. I stopped, holding my breath, waiting for them to fade. But they didn't. They continued in step with my own. I whirled around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, the flickering lights casting long, distorted shadows. I swallowed hard, fighting the rising panic. My flashlight caught the far wall, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shape, a silhouette. It was standing at the end of the hall, just beyond the faint light of the hallway. Tall, thin, and unnatural in the way it loomed. It was like the shape of a person, but something was wrong. Its limbs stretched too long, too thin. The head tilted to one side like it was studying me. And the worst part? It didn't move when I saw it. It just stood there watching. I didn't even realize I had taken a step backward until my foot hit the edge of the plastic sheeting on the floor, and it crinkled loudly under my boot. The sound made me flinch, and I looked up, again only to find the silhouette gone. I stood there frozen, my eyes darting from the empty space in front of me to the hall behind me. The footsteps had stopped. The air had grown impossibly cold. Then I felt it, a cold, damp breath on the back of my neck. It wasn't the chill of the building. It was something closer. Something that shouldn't have been there. The hairs on. My neck prickled as my heartbeat echoed in my ears. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. I felt it, something looming just behind me, close enough to touch. I could almost hear the faint rustling of fabric, the slow, deliberate shift of a body drawing nearer. I couldn't stop myself. I spun around, and there it was. The figure was standing inches from me, taller than any man I'd ever seen. Its face an abyss of darkness. No eyes, no mouth. Just nothing. The shadows around it clung to it like it was part of the building itself, an extension of the darkness that had always been there. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I stared at the void where its face should have been, my breath caught in my throat. The air grew thick, oppressive, as though the very room was closing in on me. The lights above flickered again, casting the figure's shadow against the walls, elongating it like a monstrous apparition. I could hear the slow rasp of my own breath, and then it moved. The figure stepped forward, its form shifting, stretching in ways that didn't make sense. It was no longer just a silhouette, but a shape that seemed to defy logic, bending and flowing like liquid night. A terrible, unnatural cold seeped into my skin, and I staggered back, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, in a low, guttural voice, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The words crawled up my spine, each syllable wrapping around me like chains. The room seemed to close in further, suffocating me with its weight. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of a being that shouldn't exist. My flashlight flickered one last time, and in the brief moment of darkness, I heard the sound of something dragging, scraping against the walls. Nails. Long, jagged nails, running across the drywall like claws raking through paper. I snapped out of my trance, my instincts taking over. I couldn't face it, I couldn't fight it, I just had to run. I turned and bolted down the hall, the flashlight trembling in my hand, illuminating only the path ahead. I heard the figure move behind me, its slow, deliberate footsteps echoing, in time with mine. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. My chest burned as I ran, my breath sharp and panicked, and the elevator felt impossibly far away. When I reached it, the doors were already open, waiting for me. I dove inside, slamming the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut with a soft thunk, but I could still hear the faint echo of footsteps in the hall, the sound of nails dragging across the walls. The elevator dropped, and I finally let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My hands were shaking, my mind reeling from what I had just seen. It couldn't have been real. It couldn't have. But then again, nothing about that floor had been real. Not for a long time. When the elevator reached the ground floor, I stumbled out into the lobby, my legs weak beneath me. I didn't care if anyone saw me, I just had to get out of that building, I had to leave. As I walked out into the night, the doors of Blackwood Tower slid shut behind me with a soft hiss, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But as I glanced up at the building, something made my stomach turn. There, on the 23rd floor, a figure stood at the window, tall, thin, and silhouetted against the glow of the city lights. And this time, it waved. I never meant to work at Brantley Ironworks for as long as I have. The place was a dead end, a factory full of machines that ground away day in and day out, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the metallic scent of burning steel. The smell clung to your clothes, your skin, your hair. But it was steady work, and that's what I needed when I first walked in. It's one of those businesses that seems stuck in time. The shop floor is filled with massive machines, grinders, welders, presses, all doing the same thing they did 50 years ago. Everything about the place feels ancient. The walls are thick with grime and soot, and the ceilings are so high you feel like you're in a cavern. There's a certain comfort in the monotony of it all. But every so often I would hear something that didn't quite sit right with me. It started about a month into my shifts. I was welding a steel beam on the far side of the shop, the grinding, sound of the torch hissing in the cold night air. I was used to the hum of the machines and the constant drone of the ventilation system, but that night there was something else, something beneath the usual noise. At first I thought it was just the building settling. The place was old after all, and everything creaks and moans as it ages. But the sound, it was too deliberate. It was a slow, heavy creak, followed by a brief pause and then a dragging noise, like something being pulled across a wooden floor. Wiped the sweat from my forehead and glanced around. No one else was in the shop with me. The night shift was always dead quiet, just me and the machines, and usually Vince, the owner, who stayed in the office. But tonight, it felt different. The sound was coming from above, from the loft. The loft. I had seen it before, but never paid much attention to it. It was a small, cramped storage area up in the rafters, accessible only by a rusty pull-down ladder. Vince had always told me it was off-limits, full of old junk, and that no one ever needed to go up there. I respected his wishes, Never really. Thinking about what could be up there. But now, with those creaking noises above me, I couldn't help but wonder. It didn't sound like settling. It sounded like someone walking. I shut off the welder and listened. The creaks continued. 3 steps, a pause, a dragging sound. My heart picked up the pace. What the hell was that? I made my way over to the ladder, my boots heavy on the steel floor. I peered up into the dim light. But there was nothing up there, just shadows and the rusted metal beams that held the loft in place. Vince had told me before that the loft was sealed off, but the noises didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up there, waiting. I tried to push it out of my mind. It could have been a rat or the building settling, but I knew deep down that wasn't it. There was something deliberate about those sounds, like someone or something was moving up there. I decided to ask Vince the next time I saw him, but I quickly regretted it. I wasn't prepared for what he'd say. "Old building settles at night," he said with a chuckle. "Don't worry about it. You get used to it." His nonchalant tone didn't reassure me at all. Vince didn't seem to take things seriously, but I noticed something in his eyes when I brought it up, something that hinted at a deeper knowledge he wasn't willing to share. I didn't press him. What could I say? I wasn't ready to make a big deal about it, especially with him as the boss. But after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The creaks, the dragging sound, the fact that the loft had been sealed off. It all stuck with me, gnawing, at the back of my mind. The noise didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. The next few nights, the creaks became more rhythmic. 3 steps, a pause, followed by the dragging scrape again. But now it was louder. It wasn't just a creak, it was a step. There was something up there, and it was moving. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that loft, it wasn't just some old building settling. Something was awake, and it was calling to me. I tried to convince myself I was just tired. After all, I'd been working long hours, but deep down I knew this was different. There was something in the loft, something that shouldn't be there, and every night it seemed to get closer. Little did I know the real nightmare was just beginning. The days blurred together after that. I'd be at Brantley Ironworks by night, welding, grinding, and working through the endless stacks of metal, pieces only to go home and crash into bed. It's the kind of job that doesn't leave much room for thinking, just a constant cycle of movement, steel, and sweat. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, the creaking from the loft stayed with me. It became something I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't just the odd sound now, it was the pattern. By the 3rd night, I knew something was wrong. The creaks, which had once seemed like random settling noises, had turned into a distinct rhythm, slow and deliberate, like someone walking, back and forth on an old wooden floor. 3 creaks, a pause, then a dragging scrape, like someone was dragging something heavy behind them. The timing never changed. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was up there was following a routine. Could still hear it faintly. From where I stood in the shop below, my welder was sputtering as I worked, the sparks flying from the metal, but all I could hear was that rhythm above. 3 steps, a pause, and then that scrape. Over and over again. I tried to focus on the task at hand, cutting a section of steel for an upcoming job. But every time I moved, every time I tried to shake it off, the sound would hit me again. The shop was silent except for the hum of machines and the occasional clang of metal. But the loft was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, thick, and I could feel it pressing down on me the longer I stood there. I couldn't concentrate. My hands shook a little as I reached for the welding torch, the heat of it doing nothing to warm the chill creeping up my spine. Every once in a while I would stop and listen. The rhythm was there, still steady, still constant. My mind kept racing with questions. What the hell was making that sound? Was someone else up there? Maybe a rat or an animal, but then why the dragging sound? And why did it feel so intentional? No animal would move like that. I looked up at the loft. It was almost too dark to see up there, but I could make out the faint outline of the ladder hanging from the rafters. The same rusty pull-down ladder I'd walked past 1,000 times without giving it a second thought. But now it felt different. The space above seemed to have its own weight, its own gravity pulling my attention toward it. I couldn't help but wonder what, or who, was up there. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to confront. I left my welding torch on the workbench and walked over to the ladder. It was still sealed shut, or so I thought. Vince had made it clear that the loft was off limits, and I had never really given it much thought before. But now, it was as if that door above was calling to me, pulling me in like an unseen force. I grabbed the rungs and pulled the ladder down with a loud creak. It felt heavier than it should have been, like the metal had grown stiff with age. The ladder swung down with a sharp metallic sound, and I took a hesitant step forward. I stood beneath it for a moment, staring at the dark space above, unsure of what I was about to do. But then, the creaking came again. 3 steps, a pause, and then the dragging sound. It was like it was coming from the loft itself, waiting for me. The noise seemed so deliberate now, so constant, like it was beckoning me to climb up. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Dust, cobwebs, old tools left behind from years of neglect. But the longer I stood there, the more unsettled I became. Something about the air around me felt colder. It wasn't just the chill of the shop. It was something else, something in the loft above that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I thought about Vince's words. Nothing up there but junk. Ladder's been bolted shut for a reason. He had been so casual about it, but I now realized how serious he had been when he said it. He'd warned me not to ask about the loft, but I had ignored it. And now I couldn't ignore the sounds, the rhythm that had become a constant in my nights. What was up there? And why hadn't anyone gone up in years? A voice in my head screamed at me to leave it alone, to stop before I made a mistake. But another voice, one that had been whispering to me ever since I first heard the creaks, told me I had to know. With a deep breath, I began to climb the ladder. My hands gripped the cold metal rungs, and I could hear my breathing getting heavier. The sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what I expected, but the more I climbed, the more the noise above seemed to grow louder. The creaking, the dragging scrape. It was all getting closer, more real. I reached the top and swung myself over the lip of the loft. The air was colder up there, and I immediately regretted climbing. The place smelled like old wood, oil, and rust. The light from below barely reached the loft, leaving everything in deep shadows. I stood for a moment, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. And then I heard it again. 3 steps. A pause, the dragging sound, but now it was close. So close. I froze, my blood running cold. There was something up here, something that was making the noises, something that had been waiting for me. The room was silent now except for the sound of my own breath. I took 1 step forward and then a loud bang echoed from the far corner of the loft. I whipped around, heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the stacks of old crates and forgotten metal parts. But there was no one there, except for something I couldn't see. I wish I could say I'd left the loft that night with a sense of relief. But the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. And as I climbed back down the ladder and locked it in place, I felt a weight in my chest, like I'd just missed something. Something I wasn't meant to see. The ladder's metal rungs scraped against the rafters as I pulled it back up, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after I'd returned to the main floor. I couldn't focus on anything after that. The machines hummed and buzzed around me, but all I could hear was the creaking from above, the rhythmic steps that echoed in my mind. It was like I could still feel the weight of whatever had been up there, like it had marked me, and it wanted something in return. By morning, I was exhausted. The night dragged on too long, the noise in my head making it impossible to concentrate. My hands shook as I tightened bolts into a steel frame, my mind racing back to the loft. What had I heard up there? I couldn't explain it. The shadows were so thick, the air so still, that every creak and scrape seemed unnatural. But it was the smell I couldn't shake, like rust, oil, and something else. something sickly sweet. I tried to get back to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I needed to know what was in that loft, and the more I tried to push the thought away, the more it gnawed at me. After a couple of days of restless shifts, I decided I had to ask Vince about the loft. There was no way I could keep working like this with the noise always in the background and the questions building up in my mind. Vince was always around in the mornings, sitting behind his desk with a cup of coffee in his hand, his gruff demeanor rarely changing. I figured it was as good a time as any to ask. "Vince," I began, standing at the edge of his office. "About the loft. I've been hearing some weird noises coming from up there. What's the deal with it? Is there something I'm missing?" Vince didn't even look up from his paperwork. He just took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and then let out a laugh. A deep, throaty sound that didn't sit right with me. "Old building settling," he said, his voice thick with disinterest. "Don't think too much about it. That loft's been locked for years. Nothing up there but junk." I watched him, waiting for more, but he didn't offer anything else. I leaned against the door frame, pressing for more of an explanation. "What kind of junk? Why is it locked?" His face tightened for a second, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't look up. "Just stuff," he muttered. "Tools, old parts. It's been bolted shut for a reason." I noticed a flicker in his eyes. It was brief, but I saw it. Something wasn't right. He hadn't been joking when he mentioned the lock. There was something behind his words, something that told me I was pushing too far. "But why is it locked, Vince? Why hasn't anyone been up there in all this time?" Vince's expression darkened. He threw his cigarette into the ashtray and stood up, slamming the drawer shut with a force that made me flinch. He didn't answer right away. Then, without meeting my gaze, he muttered, "I told you not to ask about the loft, Lucas. My granddad sealed it up back in '58 after an accident. Some things don't stay buried. You'd be better off forgetting about it." I opened my mouth to ask more, but he held up a hand. "Just let it go," he said quietly. "You don't want to know what's up there." I left his office with a knot in my stomach. Whatever had happened in that loft, whatever Vince wasn't saying, it was enough to make him warn me off. I tried to forget it, but I couldn't. The images kept flooding my mind. Scratches around, the latch, the strange noises, the cold air I'd felt when I stood near the ladder. What could be so bad that Vince wouldn't talk about it? That night I was back in the shop. The grinding machines and the hum of the lights filled the silence. But in the back of my mind, all I could think about was the loft. I kept glancing at the ladder, wondering what it was hiding. I'd had enough of Vince's silence, and I knew I had to get answers, even if it meant breaking his rules. I waited for the shop to quiet down, just me and the machines at that hour, and then I went over to the ladder. The same pull-down ladder that had been bolted shut for years. The same ladder that I had tried to ignore. The same one I had walked past every night, never giving it a second thought. But tonight I wasn't walking past it. Tonight I was going up. I grabbed the rusted metal rungs and pulled the ladder down. It groaned under the weight of years of disuse, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But something was different now. The sounds above were louder, closer, more insistent. 3 steps, a pause, then the dragging scrape. It was there, waiting for me. The climb felt longer than it should have. Every step was a struggle. But I kept going, driven by something I didn't quite understand. I reached the top and swung my legs over the edge of the loft. The space was thick with darkness, the only light coming from the dusty windows of the shop below. I shone my flashlight around, the beam barely cutting through the gloom. There was nothing but old crates and steel beams, scattered like forgotten memories. But the air up here felt colder, heavier. And the noises? They were louder now, closer. The creaks were no longer in the distance, they were right behind me. Something was in this loft. Something was moving. I turned my flashlight to the corner of the room. The beam wavered, and I thought I saw something shift in the dark. A shadow, a shape that didn't belong. And then the scraping sound came again, louder this time, closer. dragging itself toward me. I wasn't alone. The flashlight in my hand shook as I pointed it toward the corner of the loft. My breath caught in my throat, my heart racing so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but something kept me rooted in place. I couldn't explain it. I shouldn't have been up here in the first place, but now that I was, I couldn't turn back. Something was pulling me in, like the air itself was thick with a hidden pressure. The shadow in the corner wasn't a trick of the light. It was real, too real. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a pile of discarded tarps and old crates. But then, as the flashlight's beam shifted, it moved. Slowly, painfully slowly, the shadow shifted in a way that defied physics. It wasn't just an object being moved by the wind, it was something else. Something alive. The sound, the dragging scrape, was louder now, like the thing was pulling itself across the wooden floor. It was so unnatural, so wrong. I was frozen, unable to look away as the shadow stretched out, twisting into something grotesque. My mind raced with 100 explanations, none of them rational. Could it be an animal? A rat, maybe? But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't. The sound wasn't right. It wasn't an animal. It was something that had no business being in this loft. I finally managed to take a breath and force myself to move, even though my limbs felt like lead. I inched back toward the ladder, my eyes never leaving the shadow as it seemed to grow in size. I couldn't look away. I couldn't blink. The more I watched, the more I felt like I was becoming part of the scene, trapped in whatever nightmare this place had become. The cold in the air was suffocating now, and my breath came out in short, visible puffs. I could see the dust motes in the air swirling around in the beam of my flashlight. Everything felt wrong. The loft, the old wooden beams above, the crates piled high. Everything felt like it had been untouched for years. And yet something was stirring. The scraping sound stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. An eerie silence that stretched on far too long. My skin prickled with the absence of sound, like the world was holding its breath. Then, the whispering started. It was soft at first, too quiet to make out, but it was there. A low, almost inaudible murmur, just beneath the threshold of hearing. It sounded like words, but they were garbled, indistinct, as if the speaker was buried beneath layers of earth. The voice slithered through the air, cold and hollow. I backed up a step, then another. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I wanted to run, to leave this place behind, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that corner. It felt like I was being drawn in, like something in that dark space wanted me to stay, to look deeper, to uncover whatever it was that had been hiding in this loft all these years. The voice became clearer, and my blood ran cold when I recognized the words. "You shouldn't have come up here." The whisper sent a jolt through me. I was no longer alone. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I opened my mouth, desperate to make a noise, but my throat closed tight. The air felt thicker now, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the room were spinning around me. My vision blurred at the edges, and my mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. Then suddenly I saw it. A hand, skeletal, twisted, and far too long, reached out from the corner. It dragged itself along the wooden floor, pulling itself, inch by inch, until it rested on the edge of the crates. The fingers were gnarled, twisted like old tree roots, and the nails were sharp, yellowed claws. The hand wasn't just reaching out, it was beckoning me. It was like it was trying to lure me in, to draw me closer to whatever lay beyond the shadows. I knew I should have bolted. I knew I should have run as fast as I could, but the thing's eyes, those dark, hollow pits, stared at me from the shadows. I couldn't tear my gaze away. There was something about it that kept me paralyzed, something that whispered directly into my soul. "You belong here. You're like me." The words came again, clear and unmistakable. The voice wasn't just in my ears anymore. It was in my head. It was inside my thoughts, turning them dark and twisted, pulling at my sanity. My breathing grew shallow as I felt my legs give out beneath me. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor, casting erratic shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it. From the darkened corner of the loft, the thing emerged in full view. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could even comprehend. It was like a twisted amalgamation of shadow and bone. Its skin stretched tight over its frame, its limbs unnaturally long, bending in ways they shouldn't. The thing stood there, its face twisted in a grimace that seemed to be frozen in time. Its mouth was open, two wide, jagged teeth protruding from its gums, and its eyes, those black soulless pits, stared directly into mine. My body finally responded, and I turned, running toward the ladder. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My heart was pounding in my chest, my legs moving faster than they ever had before, as if the thing was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I reached the bottom of the ladder, scrambled down it, and slammed the hatch shut behind me with everything I had. I didn't stop to breathe. I didn't stop to think. I ran straight to the door, yanked it open, and bolted into the night air, gasping for breath like I'd been underwater for hours. My hands were shaking, my whole body trembling from the adrenaline and fear that surged through me. As I reached the parking lot, I dared a quick glance back at the shop, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from the loft's grimy windows. But there was nothing. I don't know what I saw in that loft. Maybe it was all in my head, maybe it was just an old building creaking and groaning, playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. The following morning, after everything had happened, I didn't go back to work. I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to step foot inside that building again, not after what I'd witnessed in the loft. My entire body felt like it had been shaken to its core. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. I kept replaying the events of last night over and over again, trying to make sense of what I saw, what I heard. But no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, the truth was always the same. Something was in that loft. And whatever it was not human. I sat in my apartment all day, staring out the window at the gray, dreary morning, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by exhaustion. The more I thought about it, the less it seemed real, but deep down I knew it wasn't just in my head. I kept seeing the twisted face, the way its mouth gaped open with those sharp, jagged teeth, the cold, empty eyes. I could still feel the pull, the whispering voice that had slithered into my mind. It had made me feel like I belonged there, like I was part of it. It was that feeling that terrified me the most. Around dusk, I called in sick to work. I didn't care if it meant losing my job. I didn't care about anything except putting distance between myself and Brantley Ironworks. I couldn't go back, not to that place. But then the phone rang. It was Vince Brantley. The voice on the other end of the line was surprisingly calm, but there was a quiet urgency beneath his words. "Lucas, you need to come back," Vince said. "We need to talk." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Talk? About what?" "About the loft," Vince said, his voice dropping a little lower. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There's a reason you saw what you saw, and there's a reason you felt what you felt. You need to understand something." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to say. "Please," Vince added. "Just come back. We'll explain everything." There was something in his tone that made me hesitate. The same man who had brushed off my concerns for weeks, the same man who laughed when I brought up the noises, now sounded serious, desperate even. I didn't want to go back. Every cell in my body screamed against the idea. But something inside me, the part that wanted to know the truth, urged me to go. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, but I needed to understand what had happened. Didn't go back to the shop right away. It was nearly an hour before I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The walk to Brantley Ironworks felt longer than usual. The evening air had a strange heaviness to it, as if the world itself knew something terrible was about to unfold. When I arrived, the shop was dark, save for the flickering lights above. Vince was waiting by the door. His face was grim, like he hadn't slept in days. "You're here," he said, and there was a strange note of relief in his voice. "I don't understand," I said, my voice hoarse. "What's going on, Vince?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he led me through the shop, past the rows of machines that loomed like silent giants in the dark. The place felt different now, more oppressive, heavier somehow. We reached the loft and Vince stopped in front of the ladder. "Go up," he said simply. I stared at him, not moving. "What's up there, Vince?" He hesitated, his eyes shifting. Then, after a long silence, he spoke. "It's not just an old building, Lucas. There's something buried in the loft, something that should have been sealed off a long time ago. My grandfather was the one who built this place, and he knew about it. He knew what was up there, and he sealed it off in 1958. But that didn't stop it. It didn't stop it from coming back." "Coming back?" My voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" Vince took a deep breath, clearly struggling with something. "It wasn't an accident, the death. The thing you saw. It's connected to a man who died here years ago in that very loft. My grandfather tried to hide it, but the truth is that man didn't die in an accident. He was murdered." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Murdered?" "Yeah. My grandfather, he worked with a mechanic named Richard Ritchie IV. Ritchie was a good guy, but something happened. No one knows exactly what went down, but my grandfather knew Ritchie was changing. He'd been working with some equipment up in that loft for weeks. Strange equipment. People said he was trying to build something that shouldn't have been built. There was a lot of blood." I swallowed hard, the words sinking in like rocks in my stomach. I couldn't speak for a moment. Vince's voice grew quieter. "Ritchie died in that loft, but his body was never found. My grandfather, he sealed the door because Ritchie didn't stay dead. I don't know what happened after that, but there's been something up there ever since. It's been waiting. It wants out. It wants to finish what it started." I looked up at the loft's ladder again. The air seemed to thicken around me. "I told you not to ask about the loft," Vince murmured. "I didn't want you to know the truth. I didn't want anyone to know, but it's too late. It's awake again." Suddenly I felt something cold on my neck. It was a breath, icy and putrid, as if something was standing just behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. It had come for me. Without a word, I bolted for the exit, not daring to look back. Vince didn't try to stop me, and I knew, somewhere deep down, that it wasn't just fear that made me run. It was instinct. I never went back to Brantley Ironworks after that night. I heard rumors, of course. People said the shop closed down not long after. The business shuttered for good. The building was eventually sold, but no one wanted it. They said that after I left, things got worse, that the presence in the loft, the thing that had once been Ritchie, grew stronger. I don't know what happened in that building after I left, but I know one thing for sure. The truth was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined, and whatever was in that loft, it wasn't done with me yet. My name is Mia, and I was always drawn to the abandoned, the forgotten. It was the unknown that called to me, the thrill of stepping into places most people would avoid. That's how I found myself in the woods outside Ravensbrook, Maine, standing in front of the infamous Blackwood Asylum. Jake, Tyler, Noah, and I had been planning this for months. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, but the rumors still swirled around it. Whispers of dark experiments, of patients who had been treated in ways that shouldn't be possible. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the facility had been a place of horrors, shut down after multiple reports of abuse, unexplained deaths, and accounts of something worse lurking in the halls. The building had been condemned long ago, and now it was just a crumbling shell in the middle of nowhere. We'd always wanted to break in to see it for ourselves, and tonight we were going to do it. The first thing that hit me when we pushed open the heavy oak doors was the smell. It wasn't just the musty scent of rot, but something else, something sickly sweet, almost like old medicine mixed with decay. The doors creaked loudly as they swung open, and the sound seemed to echo forever down the empty halls. Jake led the way, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was damp and cold, but it wasn't just the temperature, it felt heavy, like the building itself was breathing. My boots clicked against the concrete floor, and my breath came out in soft clouds as the chill of the building sunk into my bones. The walls were stained with water damage, and the wallpaper, which had once been a faded shade of green, was peeling away, revealing layers of cracked plaster. Some sections were marked with faded handprints, scratches that were too deep to be from just wear and tear. Tyler pulled out his camera, snapping pictures of the crumbling interior. "This place is perfect," he said, the excitement in his voice clear. But even I could tell something was off. It wasn't just the decay, it was the silence. It felt wrong. We made our way further in, exploring the empty reception area. First, a long counter stretched in front of us, covered in dust. Behind it was a shelf filled with yellowed medical files and a faded journal. Mia picked it up, and the moment her fingers touched the pages, a shiver ran through me. "Hey, look at this," she said, her voice tense as she skimmed through the journal. She read aloud. "They're not patients anymore. They're something else. Dr. Vallis was right. The treatment changed them. God help us if they get out." Her voice trailed off as we all exchanged nervous glances. I didn't want to think about what that meant, but the sense of unease was growing stronger by the second. The air felt heavier, the weight of the place settling deeper in my chest. We continued our exploration, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Noah, who had been trailing behind, suddenly stopped, his breath hitching. He pointed to the second floor. "Did you see that?" At first none of us saw anything, but Noah was adamant. His finger was shaking as he pointed. There was someone standing by the window, a face, pale, staring at us. I turned toward the window, but there was nothing there. Nothing but dark, glass, and the faint reflection of the flashlight beam. "It's probably just a trick of the light," Jake said, trying to brush it off. But Noah wasn't convinced. I swear it was there, watching us. I didn't know what to believe, but a sinking feeling had settled in my stomach. I wanted to leave, but we were already too deep. This wasn't just a rundown building. It was a place where something terrible had happened, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever was left behind here, it was still watching. We moved on, deeper into the asylum. The smell seemed to intensify, and the walls began to close in around us. But none of us said anything. We were too drawn to the mystery, to the history of the place. Maybe that's what kept us moving forward, even when every instinct inside me screamed to turn back. And then the noises started. At first it was subtle, just the creaking of the old wooden floors above us, like the building was settling. But it wasn't the building. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, like something, was walking above us, pacing back and forth. I froze. Jake's flashlight flickered and Tyler muttered something about the batteries being low. But I wasn't worried about the flashlight. I was worried about the footsteps. "I don't think we're alone," I whispered. Noah nodded, his face pale. "I saw someone, up there, on the second floor, for real this time." Jake shook his head. "It's just an old building. Settle down." But none of us were settled. Tyler pulled out his camera again. "I'm getting some good shots in here," he said, trying to lighten the mood, but his voice wavered slightly. "This place is creeping me out too." As we made our way deeper into the asylum, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Not just the noise, not just the sounds in the walls, but something else. Something watching us, something waiting. And we hadn't even begun to uncover the worst of it yet. We wandered deeper into Blackwood Asylum, the heavy, suffocating silence pressing in on us from all sides. The air felt thick, clinging to our skin, and every step we took seemed to echo louder than the last. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the walls, revealing more of the decay that had overtaken the building over the years. The dampness in the air made it hard to breathe, and I could taste the mildew in the back of my throat, like it was coating my lungs with every inhale. We walked through the reception area, leaving the dust-covered journal behind. No one spoke, none of us wanted to. There was something unsettling about the place, something that crawled under your skin and made every nerve twitch. I kept thinking back to the journal Mia had found, to the chilling line. They're not patients anymore. They're something else. What had happened here? Why had it been shut down? The rumors had always been vague, but I had a sense that something far worse had taken place than the stories let on. Dr. Velas. That name had stuck in my mind ever since Mia read it aloud. Who was he? What had he done? We moved further into the building and the sense of unease deepened. The hallway we entered seemed to stretch on forever, the lights above buzzing faintly. I kept checking the shadows, expecting something, or someone, to step out of them, but every time I turned, nothing was there. The feeling of being watched intensified with every passing minute, and the silence started to feel oppressive. Tyler snapped a few more photos, trying to document the decay, but his usual excitement had faded. I could see it in his face. He wasn't just here for the adventure anymore. He was scared, but none of us wanted to admit it. "Noah," I said, my voice a little too loud in the thick silence. "Are you sure about what you saw earlier? A face in the window?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes darting to the far end of the hall where a rusted door was slightly ajar. I don't know. It could have been a reflection, I guess. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something was looking at us. "I'm not sure we're alone," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. I wasn't sure if it was the building or the anxiety gnawing at me, but I had the distinct impression that something, or someone, was following us. It was like the building itself was alive, watching, waiting. We turned the corner, entering what looked like an old nurse's station. There were cabinets lined up along the walls, some with their doors hanging off the hinges, revealing empty shelves and scattered papers. The place smelled like old perfume mixed with decay, sharp, nauseating. Mia was the first to speak. "Hey, look at this," she said, bending down to pick up a small leather-bound journal from the counter. The book was thick with dust, but her fingers were gentle as she opened it. I watched her eyes scan the pages, the tension in her shoulders stiffening with each word she read aloud. "They're not patients anymore. They're something else." Dr. Velas was right. The treatment changed them. God help us if they get out, Demo. Air around us seemed to grow heavier as she spoke. The words lingered in the space between us, hanging like a curse. I felt my heart thudding in my chest, my breath quickening. What had Dr. Velas done? What had happened to the patients? Before any of us could respond, Jake's voice cut through the silence. "This place is freaking me out. Maybe we should head back." But we didn't. We couldn't. Something kept drawing us deeper into the asylum, as though the building itself was luring us into its dark corners. Tyler led the way, his camera clicking away, but his hands were shaky now. The bravado from earlier, replaced with a nervous energy that was impossible to ignore. As we moved down the hallway, the creaking noises started again. At first it was subtle, a small squeak in the floorboards above us. But then it came again, louder this time. Slow, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing above us. I froze. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Noah's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It's coming from upstairs." The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking above us, dragging its feet like it was pacing. The footsteps had a rhythm to them, now like it knew we were here and it was watching us. Jake cursed under his breath. "It's probably just the building settling. This place is old as hell." But I didn't believe that. No building settles like that. Tyler looked over at me, his face pale and his camera hanging loosely at his side. "We should leave. This isn't worth it." But as he spoke, the air grew colder, and I could feel my breath fogging up in front of me. It was sudden, like someone had opened a freezer door in the middle of the hallway. The cold hit me like a slap to the face, and I shivered involuntarily. Jake and Mia exchanged confused glances. "What the hell is going on?" Mia whispered, and that's when we all heard it. A deep, rattling breath, like something had inhaled, a lungful of rust. It came from above, and it was so loud, so visceral, that I could almost feel it vibrating through my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building. It was something else. The cold intensified, and then the footsteps started again, this time closer, faster. It was moving toward us. "Get out." "Now," I gasped. But as we turned to leave, I felt it. A presence. Behind us. It was there. Standing. Just out of view, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Something, or someone, was in this place with us. I didn't know how long I could keep going. I just knew that the deeper we went into Blackwood Asylum, the more we were becoming part of it. Whatever haunted this place, it didn't want us to leave. And I had a sinking feeling that we wouldn't, not unless it allowed us to. We weren't alone anymore, and whatever was here with us, and it was just getting started. We kept moving, but the air felt heavier with each step we took. The distant creaking above us had stopped, but the whispers that had been scratching at the edge of our minds only grew louder. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing and watching. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to find someone, or something, waiting, but it was always just shadows, dark, oppressive, and never still. After what felt like hours, we reached the patient wing. The walls here were grimier than the rest of the building. The paint was peeling, revealing chunks of cracked plaster underneath, and the floor was littered with debris. I could hear the faint scurrying of something small in the walls. Rats, maybe, or something worse. The sounds weren't quite right, but it was hard to tell through the gnawing terror building in the pit of my stomach. It was Tyler who suggested we check out the surgical suite. His camera was still clicking away, but the enthusiasm from earlier had vanished. Instead of capturing the rusted remnants of the building, his photos seemed increasingly desperate, as though he was trying to preserve something that he knew wouldn't last. "I've heard stories about the operating rooms here," Tyler said, quietly, eyes flicking nervously over his shoulder. "They say this is where the worst of it happened." I wanted to tell him to stop talking, but I didn't. Instead, I just nodded. Maybe seeing it for ourselves would provide some answers. Maybe it would make all the weird things we'd been hearing seem more explainable. But deep down, I already knew there was no logical explanation for this place. Not anymore. The operating suite was tucked down a narrow hallway. A dark, rusted metal door creaked when we pushed it open, and the stench of decay hit us immediately. A combination of blood, antiseptic, and something else, something rotten. The room was bathed in a dull, sickly light from a flickering overhead bulb. The walls were covered in stains, some dark, others brown and old, like they had soaked in years of misery. The air felt thick, heavier than it had been outside. Inside, the room was frozen in time. The operating table, stained dark brown, stood at the center of the room like a monument to forgotten horrors. A set of rusted surgical tools lay on a nearby tray, still positioned as if someone had just used them. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "This is messed up," Noah muttered, his voice low and tight. "What kind of hospital is this?" I didn't answer. I was too distracted by the atmosphere, by the feeling that we weren't alone. There was something so wrong about this room, something suffocating. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we were being watched. Jake was the first to speak again, though he sounded hesitant. "We should go. This place is giving me the creeps." But before any of us could move, the room seemed to shift. It wasn't subtle. The air grew colder, and suddenly the buzzing of the lights above became louder, more invasive. It wasn't the electricity. It wasn't the failing bulbs. It felt deliberate, as if something had just decided to make itself known. I froze, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. From somewhere deep within the room, we heard it, a low, grinding sound, like metal scraping against metal. We turned in, unison, eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing to see, just the abandoned remnants of a place long forgotten. "What was that?" Mia whispered, her voice cracking as she stepped closer to me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my chest constricted. The room felt alive, pressing in on us. The noise came again, a scraping sound like a rusted surgical cart being dragged across the floor. Tyler cursed under his breath and snapped another photo, his camera's shutter clicking unnervingly loud in the thick silence. As if the sound could somehow protect him, or us. But I knew better. Suddenly, from the darkness near the door, the surgical cart moved. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker at first, but it was unmistakable. The cart was gliding across the floor, pushed by an invisible hand. It crashed into the wall with a loud bang, and the entire room seemed to shudder with it. Jake jumped back, stumbling over the edge of the operating table, nearly falling over. His eyes were wide with panic. "Get out! Now!" he shouted. We bolted for the door, but before we could reach it, the temperature dropped even further. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was freezing. I could feel the chill sink into my bones, like the air itself was growing heavier, thicker. Each breath I took felt sharp and painful, like inhaling ice. "Move, move!" I yelled, but my voice felt small against the oppressive silence that had descended on us. The shadows seemed to reach out, stretching toward us like long, gnarled fingers. I grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her toward the door, but it felt like we were wading through thick fog. The cold was suffocating, but the worst part was the sound, the scraping, dragging sound that had become louder, closer. Then I heard it, a laugh, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't human. It was low, guttural, the kind of sound that made your blood run cold. And it came from behind us. Tyler's scream echoed through the hall before it was cut off abruptly. In that instant, everything seemed to freeze. Time stopped. My heart skipped a beat and my stomach churned. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. The door. We needed to get out. We had to leave. But Tyler was gone. We ran. But Tyler was gone. And whatever had taken him, whatever had dragged him away into the dark recesses of Blackwood Asylum was still here. It was still hunting us. I don't know how long we ran for. The air inside Blackwood Asylum felt thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides, suffocating any hope we had of escaping. The long hallways seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, and the doors we'd come through had disappeared into the darkness, leaving us disoriented and terrified. "Tyler's gone," Mia shouted, her voice cracking as she stumbled beside me, her breath shallow and panicked. "We need to find him. He can't just be—" "Shut up," I hissed, gripping her arm tightly. I knew what she was trying to say. Tyler was gone. We couldn't help him now, but I didn't have the courage to put it into words. The sound of his scream was still fresh in my mind, the way it was cut off, just silenced, like something had grabbed him and dragged him away. It was the most unnatural thing I'd ever heard, and we were next. "We need to get out of here." "Now," Jake said, his voice rough, his eyes wide with fear. His camera was still hanging loosely around his neck, but he wasn't thinking about pictures anymore. No one was. We were close to the front of the building. I could feel it. The faintest flicker of light from a window, the low, grating hum of the old pipes in the walls. If we could just make it to the entrance, we could break down the doors or at least smash a window. We could escape. We had to. But as we turned a corner, the atmosphere in the hall changed. I could feel it, like a shift in the very air itself. The temperature dropped so quickly that my breath fogged up in the cold. The silence was deafening, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker around us, pooling in the corners, stretching toward us like living things. The front doors were just ahead, barely 20 feet away. The thick oak doors, once heavy and imposing, now looked weak and frail, as if they couldn't hold against a gentle push. But as we neared, something happened. The door moved. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was too far to be sure, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the hallway ahead. But then Jake saw it too. His eyes locked onto the doors, and I followed his gaze. The heavy oak doors were no longer wide open as they had been when we arrived. They were half shut. Shit, Jake muttered under his breath, stepping back. His hand trembled as he clutched his camera, but there was no time to snap pictures. Now we rushed forward, my heart pounding in my ears as I grabbed the doorknob. I turned it. Nothing, it wouldn't budge. "Let me," Noah said, shoving me aside. He yanked at the door with both hands, putting all of his weight into it. It still didn't move. The door was locked. From the outside, panic set in. We're locked in. My voice felt hollow, even to me. I turned around, looking down the darkened hallway, hoping to see something, anything that would give us a way out. But there was only the dark. No windows, no other doors. The building felt like it had swallowed us whole. "That's not possible," Mia said, her voice high with panic. "We were just outside. We can't be locked in." "Someone's messing with us," Jake said, looking over his shoulder nervously. But I could tell he didn't believe it. He was already running on fumes, his confidence long gone. "We have to keep moving, find another way." The air grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to shift, moving closer, narrowing in on us. I could hear the faintest sound, like something scraping against the floor, like claws dragging across old wood. I spun around but saw nothing. The hallway was empty, and then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out entirely. We were plunged into complete darkness. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. "Shit," Mia screamed, clutching at my arm, her voice filled with terror. "Where's Tyler? Where is he?" "No," whispering started. It came from all directions, overlapping, voices that sounded far too close to ignore. They didn't make sense, just a jumble of words. Some sounded like cries. Others were low, guttural growls. They seemed to crawl into my mind, scratching at my thoughts, pushing past the logic and reason I desperately clung to. We couldn't stay here. Whatever was hunting us, it was closing in. And we weren't going to last much longer if we didn't move. "Run!" I screamed, not caring if I sounded insane. We couldn't wait anymore. We took off down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the dark. The whispering continued, louder now, rising into a cacophony of voices. I felt like I was suffocating under their weight, each one pulling me deeper into the darkness. And then I heard it. A low scraping noise, like metal dragging along the floor. It came from behind us. I spun around, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. But the scraping sound grew louder, closer until it was right behind us. And then I saw it. A figure, pale and gaunt, its limbs twisted and unnaturally long, dragging itself toward us along the floor. Its head was tilted at a bizarre angle, its face obscured by dark shadows. But I could still see its eyes. They were wide, hollow black pits. It didn't move like a human. It moved like a thing that was never meant to walk. And the sound of its dragging limbs was the worst part. It was like nails on a chalkboard, grinding against the stone floor. "Run! Now!" I shouted again, shoving Mia ahead of me. The thing lunged forward with unnatural speed, its mouth snapping open wide. Teeth, jagged and broken like old, rusted machinery, clattered together as it reached for us. I heard Mia scream, but there was no time to think. We ran, faster than I thought possible, stumbling over each other in our frantic desperation. The sound of the thing's pursuit was deafening, getting closer, closer. We reached a door. I slammed into it with my shoulder and it gave way with a loud groan. The night air rushed in, freezing and sharp. We spilled out into the open, the first fresh breath of air in what felt like days. But I didn't stop running. Neither did Mia or Jake. We bolted through the overgrown yard, away from the asylum, away from the nightmare that had started in those cursed halls. But the worst part? As we ran, I glanced back. Just for a second, and I swear, just for a second, I saw Tyler's face in one of the broken windows. His eyes were black. He was still inside, and whatever was in there with him, it was still hungry. The world outside, Blackwood Asylum, was too quiet. The crisp night air, the chirp of distant crickets, the rustling of leaves, everything felt foreign, as if we were no longer part of it. My lungs burned with the cold. My legs were weak from running, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My mind was racing, the horror of what I had just seen in the asylum still vivid in my mind. Mia and Jake were ahead of me, their footsteps hurried and desperate. They had both gone silent, perhaps as afraid to speak as I was. We didn't know what to say. We didn't know what to feel. We had barely escaped something that wanted us dead, something we couldn't even begin to understand. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, dragging itself along the floor with its twisted limbs, its eyes wide and hungry. It had been chasing us, but I hadn't seen Tyler's face behind those broken windows. I'd seen something else, something worse, something that didn't belong. The weight of the night began to settle on me as we continued to stumble through the woods away from the asylum. The faint lights of the town of Ravensbrook were in the distance now, but the path to safety felt endless. I glanced at Mia. She was breathing heavily, but she wasn't crying. I don't know why, but that made the entire situation worse. Jake, too, had that dead look in his eyes. We were all lost in our thoughts, but none of us dared to speak. None of us dared to break the silence. But that silence didn't last long. Just as we thought we were out of danger, I heard it again. The scrape. A low, grinding sound, like nails, against metal. It was coming from behind us from the asylum. I froze. The others stopped too. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. It was the same dragging noise we had heard in the hallways. The same sound that had sent us running. I felt my blood run cold. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. Jake turned, his hand hovering near the knife at his belt, though I knew it wouldn't help against whatever had chased us. I don't hear anything," he said, his voice a little too tense. "We need to keep moving." I shook my head. I had heard it clearly. The scraping noise was getting closer, like something was being dragged behind us, slowly, deliberately. And then I heard something worse. Voices, low guttural whispers that seemed to rise from the earth itself. They were calling to us. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew that whatever had been waiting inside Blackwood Asylum was not finished with us yet. "We're not out of the woods yet," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to keep going. Don't look back." Mia looked at me, eyes wide with terror. "What if it follows us? What if it's not done?" "Whatever it is," I said, my voice hoarse. "It wants us, and we're not safe until we're far away from this place. We can't go back." But as we moved, my gut twisted. I couldn't stop thinking about Tyler, his face pale and lifeless, staring out from the asylum window. We had escaped, but Tyler hadn't. He had been taken, and I wasn't sure we could ever escape whatever had claimed him. The woods stretched on for what felt like miles, and the closer we got to the main road, the more I felt the pull of dread in my chest. We weren't out of danger yet. Then, as if on cue, the trees parted ahead, and I saw the headlights of a car coming down the road. We were close. I could feel the heat from the engine even as we stayed hidden in the woods. It was our salvation, the first real sign that we might make it out of here alive. "We can make it." "Just a little further," I urged, pushing Mia and Jake ahead. But just as we emerged from the cover of the trees, a low sound echoed from behind us. A screech. A terrible, high-pitched noise that made my bones rattle. The scraping had stopped, and now something else, something far worse, was coming. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark woods and the empty road ahead. The car's headlights grew closer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. We ran faster. I could hear the car's engine now, loud and steady, but in the pit of my stomach, something told me it was too late. It was like the air around us had shifted, thick with something I couldn't understand. The whispers had returned, louder. Now, and this time I recognized one of the voices. It was Tyler's, his voice weak and trembling, calling out for help. But there was no time. The car passed us, and we scrambled toward the side of the road, waving our arms, desperate to flag it down. The headlights blinded us for a moment, but when the car stopped, it wasn't a moment of relief. It was a moment of terror. The driver's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was shaking, and he didn't look at us. He just stared ahead, his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. His mouth opened as if he wanted to speak, but he couldn't. We jumped into the back seat, too scared to ask questions, too afraid to speak. I could feel my pulse racing as the car sped away from Blackwood Asylum and the twisted nightmare it had become. But as the car moved faster, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. The face. The pale, stretched face of the thing from the asylum. It was watching us, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, its eyes hollow black pits. And as the car sped down the road, I realized something. It wasn't just Tyler's face I'd seen in that window. It was something else. Something that had followed us, something that would never let us go. The asylum didn't just trap you inside, it never let you leave. It's hard to explain why I ended up at Hollows Point Lighthouse. Maybe it was the isolation that attracted me, the chance to get away from the noise of the world, to forget the mess I'd made of my life. Maybe it was just pure desperation, to put as much distance as I could between myself and the memories I couldn't shake. I'd always been a solitary man, but after the divorce, after losing my job in the city, I felt like I was losing pieces of myself. It was like someone was pulling the strings of my life, and every time I thought I was gaining control, another part slipped away. So, when the opportunity came to take on the position of lighthouse keeper on Blackwater Isle, I didn't think twice. The idea of being completely alone on an island with nothing but the sea and the wind for company seemed like the perfect escape. The old lighthouse had a reputation, of course. 6 keepers had disappeared from the tower over the years. Their bodies never found, but it didn't bother me. What were a few old stories compared to the peace I was craving? The boatman who dropped me off at the island didn't share my optimism. He wouldn't even set foot on the dock. He just looked at me with those hard, sunken eyes and muttered under his breath, "Bad luck place, you won't last a week, you'll see." Then he was gone, speeding away into the fog as the waves crashed against the rocks. I told myself it was just superstition. People get attached to old stories, especially when they're afraid. So, I shrugged it off and made my way up to the lighthouse. The first night was everything I'd expected and nothing I'd feared. The wind howled against the tower, rattling the windows and making the lighthouse beam sweep across the churning sea. It was beautiful in a way, a perfect solitude, a peaceful silence until the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate raps echoed from the basement. I froze. It wasn't loud enough to be a warning, but it was unsettling. The sound felt wrong, like someone was trying to get my attention. I stood still, listening. But when the wind screamed against the walls, I told myself it was just the pipes. Old buildings make strange sounds. I went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I pulled the covers tightly around me, trying to ignore the cold air seeping through the cracks in the tower. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually I drifted off, the knocking echoing in my head. The next morning, I set about getting familiar with the lighthouse. The keeper's quarters were sparse but functional. A small cot, a wooden desk, a fireplace, and a shelf lined with dusty books and old maps. On the desk I found a leather-bound journal. The spine cracked when I opened it, as if it had been left undisturbed for years. The entries were from 1937, the last one reading, "It calls from the rocks. Do not answer." The ink was smudged in places as though the writer had been in a rush. The words left me uneasy. What had they meant? What had they been running from? But I shrugged it off. I was here to do a job, and I couldn't let some old journal distract me. I had enough trouble of my own to think about. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was alone with the lighthouse again. The island felt even more isolated at night, the vastness of the ocean pressing in on all sides. The knocking came again, just before the lighthouse beam swept across the darkened sea. This time, I didn't ignore it. But when I went downstairs to check, the basement was silent. I bolted the door again and locked it. No reason to worry, I thought. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me there. In the dark. Something that hadn't been there when I first arrived. something that had come with me. And then the wind picked up. I don't believe in omens, but I've never felt as uneasy as I did that night. The wind howled through the cracks in the lighthouse, a relentless, mournful sound that rattled the windows and made the building groan, like an old man struggling to get out of bed. I couldn't sleep. I hadn't been able to since the knocking from the basement. It lingered in my mind like a bad taste in the back of my throat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 3 raps in my head, slow and deliberate, just like before. I told myself it was nothing, just old pipes or the building settling the way the boatman had said. Old buildings make strange sounds. It was nothing more than that. But then the floorboards above me creaked. I froze, heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't the wind, I knew the difference. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and slapping the rain against the tower like some kind of fury. But the noise upstairs was distinct, deliberate, slow, almost like someone was pacing the floor. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, waiting for it to happen again. There it was, a soft creak, and then another, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My throat tightened. Who could be up there? I was alone on this island, right? Maybe I was imagining things. After all, the isolation was starting to get to me. A man doesn't stay on an island like this for long without his mind starting to play tricks on him. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. The beams overhead creaked again, this time with a dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the floor. I glanced at the basement door, my mind flashing back to the journal I'd found earlier. It calls from the rocks. Do not answer. It didn't make sense. The wind was strong, the storm outside violent, but it wasn't like this before. Something was different. The building felt alive. It was as though it had a pulse of its own, like it was breathing, the air thick with something I couldn't quite identify. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the ladder that led to the tower. The creaking above me didn't stop. Each step I took seemed to make the sound louder, closer. I climbed up the ladder, my fingers brushing against the cold metal rung by rung, and when I reached the top, I pushed open the door to the small observation room. The beam of light swept across the black water below, cutting through the rain. I couldn't see anything through the window. The storm had swallowed the island whole. I stood there for a while, the lighthouse beam cutting through the night, waiting. Waiting for the noise to stop, waiting for the silence to return. But instead of silence, there was more movement, more creaking. This time, it wasn't just upstairs. It was everywhere, beneath the floorboards, in the walls, above me, below me. I felt it in my bones. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. No creaking, no footsteps. The house settled into a silence that was so deep it felt suffocating. I stood there, frozen in place, staring out at the churning sea. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I closed the door and locked it behind me, though I had no real reason to. The silence that followed was maddening. It felt wrong. There was something in that silence, like the calm before a storm. I didn't want to be here anymore, but I couldn't leave. There was nowhere to go. The island was too far out, too isolated, and the storm outside had only grown worse. I went back downstairs, the air colder than before. As I passed the basement door, I paused, hand hovering over the knob. I had bolted it earlier, hadn't I? I couldn't remember for sure, but now it felt like something was waiting behind it, something that wanted to be let in. I stood there for a long moment, my fingers trembling. Then I grabbed the doorknob and twisted it open. The basement was empty. I stepped inside, the scent of salt and rot thick in the air. The smell seemed to come from everywhere, seeping through the walls, through the cracks in the old stone. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. There was nothing, just barrels of old supplies, rusted tools, and stacks of forgotten junk. But something felt wrong. The air was too cold, too still, and then I saw it. A dark shape near the far corner of the room. A large, weathered crate. I stepped closer. The floor creaked beneath my feet, louder than usual. I reached out to touch the crate, but then I heard the knock. 3 slow raps. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, watching. I backed out of the room, heart pounding, and bolted the door behind me again. The knocking had stopped. The basement felt quieter now, almost as if it had never been disturbed. I returned to the keeper's quarters, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, the wind, the storm. But deep down I knew there was something on this island, something old and forgotten. And it was waiting. The storm raged harder that night. The waves pounded the cliffs below the lighthouse like a constant rhythmic drumbeat, and the wind screamed through the narrow windows. It felt as if the entire island was being shaken to its core, as if it were trying to shake off something old and terrible that had been buried here for a long time. I tried to focus on my work, but the unease that had settled in my stomach earlier in the day only grew. My hands were jittery as I adjusted the dials on the beacon, trying to keep my mind occupied. The lighthouse light cut through the storm, but even that felt futile, like it was no match for the vast darkness that surrounded me. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, about the 3 raps I'd heard earlier. Something about that sound, that deliberate, methodical knock, had stuck with me. It wasn't the house settling, and it wasn't just the pipes. It felt purposeful. Someone or something had been trying to get my attention. I kept telling myself I was just imagining things. The isolation, the storm, the history of the lighthouse. It was all playing tricks on me. It was all just coincidence. Nothing more. But then I saw him. I was sitting at the desk in the keeper's quarters, the logbook open in front of me, my eyes scanning the pages but not really seeing anything. My mind was elsewhere, distracted by the noise in the walls and the cold that had seeped into every corner of the tower. I glanced out the window toward the cliffs below, hoping to get a glimpse of the churning sea. Something to take my mind off things. That's when I saw him. A pale figure standing at the edge of the rocks, just beneath the cliffs. He stood perfectly still, facing the lighthouse, his back straight as if he were waiting. He was tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like an old, ragged coat, his hands at his sides, his face obscured by the shadow of the storm. For a moment I thought I was seeing things. The storm was so thick, the rain coming down in sheets. But there he was, undeniably. There, standing as if he were waiting for something. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as the wind howled and the waves crashed below. I grabbed the binoculars from the shelf, my hands shaking slightly as I focused them on the figure. Through the lens, I could see his features more clearly. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore straight into me. His hair was wild, plastered to his face by the rain, and his skin was unnaturally pale, like he hadn't seen the light of day in years. But what struck me most was the absence of movement. He didn't flinch from the storm, didn't even seem to notice the wind. I pulled the binoculars away, blinked hard, and then looked again. He was gone. I rushed to the window, heart racing, trying to catch a glimpse of him in the storm. The cliffs were empty. There was nothing but the crashing waves and the relentless wind. It didn't make sense. I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I'd seen. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared out into the blackness. It wasn't just the storm. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the figure had stood there, waiting, unmoving, as though it was part of the island itself. I turned away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to focus. I needed to ignore whatever it was I had just seen. But then my eyes fell on the logbook, the same journal I had found when I first arrived. The entries were strange, cryptic, filled with warnings, but one in particular caught my eye again. The light doesn't keep them away. It only calls them in. It made no sense. What did the journal mean? Who had written this? What was it trying to tell me? I tossed the logbook aside, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had taken root in my gut. It was just a journal from years ago. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with what I was experiencing now. But the truth was, I didn't know what was real anymore. The storm outside, the knocking in the basement, the figure standing on the cliffs, it all felt connected somehow, and that thought terrified me. I turned back to the window, scanning the cliffs again, my breath fogging up the glass. Nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the dark, swirling ocean below. But then I heard it. A faint, hollow sound carried on the wind. A voice. A whisper. Too soft to make out. It sounded almost like a sigh, like someone was breathing right next to my ear. I froze. The whisper grew louder, clearer, until I could make out the words. Come. 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 My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, heart racing. There was no one behind me, but I knew what it was. It was the call, the pull, the same thing the journal had warned about. And it was coming for me. The storm had been battering the island for hours, and by now I was used to the howling winds and the steady drumbeat of rain against the lighthouse windows. But there was something about the voice I heard, faint and whispering through the gales, that unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. Come. 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 It wasn't like the wind or the noise of the storm. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I should have known better than to listen to it, but something deep inside me felt compelled to. The feeling was almost magnetic, like the pull of gravity. I couldn't stop myself from moving toward the window, trying to peer out into the blackness of the storm, searching for something, anything that might explain what was happening. I took a few steps closer to the window, my boots scraping against the old wooden floor. My breath was shallow as I pressed my face against the cold, damp glass. The world outside was a chaotic blur of wind and water, the storm reducing everything to shadows and flashes of light. The only clear thing was the unrelenting darkness of the cliffs below. But then I saw him again. That pale figure, standing at the edge of the cliff, unmoving. This time the man was closer, just within the range of the lighthouse's beam, as though it were waiting for me to see him. He stood tall, his coat flapping in the wind, his face turned toward the lighthouse like he was staring straight at me. His eyes, those hollow black eyes, seemed to pierce through the storm and the glass, locking onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining it this time. He was there. He had to be. I could see him clearly. I felt my legs move before I even realized I had made the decision. I didn't know why, but I found myself heading for the door, my hand gripping the cold brass handle. I had to get to him. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help myself. It was like I was being led by some invisible force, something pulling me toward him, toward the cliff. I reached the stairs, my boots slapping against the cold stone steps. The wind howled through the tower like a wild animal, and I felt the temperature drop as I descended. The air was thick with salt and something far worse, a sense of decay that made me feel like I was walking into a place that didn't belong to the living. The whispers didn't stop. Come, come, come. They were louder now, almost urgent, as if the figure at the cliff was calling me by name. It wasn't just the wind, I knew that much. The voice was too personal, too familiar. I reached the door at the bottom of the stairs, the door that led out to the storm. My hand hovered over the handle, a deep gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach telling me not to open it. But it was too late. I twisted the handle and stepped outside into the fury of the storm. The wind hit me like a wall, knocking the breath from my lungs. The rain stung my face like needles, and I had to shield my eyes with my arm just to see. But through the haze, I saw him again. The pale figure standing at the cliff's edge, unmoving, as though the storm didn't touch him at all. I took a step forward, then another and another. My feet seemed to move of their own accord. sliding on the slick rocks as I made my way toward the edge. The wind was deafening now, roaring in my ears, but all I could hear was that voice, that whisper, "Come, come, come." Each step felt heavier than the last. The air was thick with something I couldn't identify, a kind of pressure that pushed against my chest. I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think straight. All I could do was move toward the figure, drawn like a moth to the flame. It felt inevitable. I couldn't stop it. I was almost there, just a few feet from the edge of the cliff, when the figure turned, slowly, deliberately. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth slightly open as if he were breathing through a cracked, lifeless throat. The figure raised one hand, its fingers long and bony, and beckoned me. It was too much. The feeling of dread that had been building inside me exploded into panic. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tried to stop. I tried to move away, but it was like the very ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. I couldn't escape. The pull was too strong. I was too close to the edge now. And then, as if to push me over the final precipice, something grabbed the back of my coat. It wasn't a hand. It was more like a force, cold, wet, and like nothing human. I tried to turn, to fight it off, but the pull was too powerful. Something, or someone, was yanking me toward the cliff, and no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I couldn't break free. I gasped, struggling to breathe, my fingers scraping against the wet rocks, trying to stop myself from being pulled into the abyss. My legs were shaking, my body giving in to the overwhelming force. And then, just as I was about to fall, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. The last thing I remember was the abyss beneath my feet and the cold, clammy hands tugging at me from behind. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer standing on the cliff, no longer inches away from falling to my death. I was in the lighthouse again, lying flat on my back, the stone floor cold beneath me. My head was pounding, my throat dry, and my chest ached as though I had been crushed under something heavy. I pushed myself up, my hands scraping against the rough surface of the floor as I staggered to my feet. The storm still raged outside, but the wind's howl seemed distant, muffled, like I was hearing it from far away. I was back in the lighthouse. But something felt different. The air was thick, suffocating, like the very space around me was charged with something I couldn't see or touch. Yet I felt it in my bones. I took a few unsteady steps toward the door, heart still hammering in my chest. The whispers had stopped for now, but I could still hear the faint, rhythmic knocking in the distance, the 3 slow, deliberate raps. It was coming from below, from the basement. I didn't know why I went back to the basement. I should have run, should have gotten out of there as fast as my legs would carry me. But something darker than fear was compelling me to go down there. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand. The door to the basement creaked open on stiff hinges, the smell of salt and decay rushing up to meet me. I didn't want to go down, but I forced myself to step onto the first stair, the wood groaning under my weight. The knocking was louder now, and with every step I took, the air around me grew colder. My breath fogged up in front of me. I couldn't stop my legs from moving. The pull was still there, just like before, just like the figure on the cliff. The basement was darker than I had ever seen it. The only light came from the faint glow of the lighthouse's beam sweeping through the open doorway, casting long shadows on the walls. As I moved deeper into the space, I could see old crates, rusted tools, and pieces of broken equipment scattered around. The smell of mildew was overpowering, and the walls seemed to close in on me as I moved toward the far corner. There was a large wooden chest, its lid partially open. I had never seen it before. It wasn't there when I first arrived. Something told me to look inside, even though every inch of me screamed to turn around and run. The lid creaked as I pulled it open, and the first thing I saw was a thick layer of dust. But beneath it, there was something else, something wrapped in faded cloth. I reached in, pulling it out slowly. The cloth was damp, but as I unwrapped it, I froze. It was a body, bloated and waterlogged, lying lifeless in my hands. The face was swollen, the eyes half open, and the skin looked like it had been underwater for months. The body was twisted, in a way that made it look like it had been pulled, dragged. The knocking had stopped. I was no longer alone. I turned slowly, feeling something cold wrap around my throat. A presence behind me. I could feel it, whatever it was. It wasn't human, it never had been. I saw the figure again, standing in the corner of the basement, its face a pale, rotting mask with hollow black eyes. The same figure from the cliff. The one that had pulled me in. The one that had called me to the edge. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and its voice, hollow, guttural, wet, whispered in my ear, "You should have come with me." The world around me began to spin, my vision blurring. The walls seemed to breathe in and out like they were alive. I felt like I was suffocating. My legs buckled beneath me and I fell to the floor, my hands scraping against the cold, slick stone. And then, for reasons I can't explain, I knew what I had to do. I stumbled back to my feet, desperation coursing through my veins. The door, just ahead. I had to get to the door. I didn't care what was behind me anymore. I didn't care about the whispers or the figures in the dark. I just had to escape. I ran. The basement door slammed shut behind me, with a deafening bang, as though something tried to stop me from leaving. But I was already up the stairs, my hands grabbing for the handle of the door to the outside world. The wind hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran toward the cliffs, toward the rocky shoreline. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below, but the sound was distant, like I was losing my grip on reality. I reached the edge of the island, my breath ragged and my body trembling. I had no idea what was chasing me or how I had managed to escape, but I was free now. I was finally free. As I looked out across the sea, the lighthouse tower behind me seemed to loom even larger, its beam sweeping across the horizon. And then, just as I thought I was safe, I saw him again. The pale man standing on the edge of the cliff. He was looking straight at me, his mouth stretched into that same grin. And then, without hesitation, he stepped off the edge. I never looked back after that. The boatman found me the next morning, half delirious and barely able to walk. I didn't tell him much. I couldn't. All I said was that the lighthouse wasn't safe, that the island was cursed. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen, what I had felt. The captain who dropped me off didn't ask any questions. He just nodded, his face pale, and said he had seen the same thing before. I never returned to Blackwater Isle. I don't know what happened to the lighthouse. I don't know if the others, those who had vanished before me, are still there, trapped in whatever darkness lingers on that island. But I know this. That place is not for the living. I don't dream about it anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint knocking at my door, 3 slow raps, and I wonder, will it ever end? The air felt heavy as I stepped into the darkened remnants of Blackridge Station. It was hard to believe that this place, once a bustling hub of travel, had been abandoned for more than 60 years. Now it sat like a decaying monument, hidden deep in the woods outside Harrow's End. The station had seen better days. Hell, it had seen any days. Its walls were crumbling, the paint peeling away in jagged strips like dried skin. The giant iron gates were rusted shut. The ticket booth sagged under the weight of time, and the platform lay empty, save for the scattered piles of old debris and broken glass. "Are we really doing this?" Dev asked, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. He looked at us, his dark eyes glinting with nervous excitement. We'd all heard the rumors about Blackridge Station, how it had been shut down after a deadly train collision in 1957. A crash that killed 47 people, most of them families heading off to vacation or just trying to get home. But the rumors, they went beyond just the tragic accident. They said the station was cursed, that people who wandered too close never came back. But of course, those were just stories. Rhea, always the one to ignore the dangers of abandoned places, pushed open the boarded-up doors with a grunt. The sharp screech of wood scraping against stone made me wince, and for a second I wondered if we were making a huge mistake. The station's musty air hit us like a wall, stale and thick with decades of dust. The space was frozen in time, as though the last passengers had simply vanished mid-step. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, covered in webs, its once grand bulbs flickering feebly in the dim light. For a second, I thought I saw something shift in the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. Lena was the first to step inside, her boots making soft thuds against the wooden floor. She stopped and glanced back at the rest of us, eyes wide. "You feel that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, though I didn't have a clue what she meant. There was something off about this place, something wrong. The others followed, and soon we were standing in the center of the main hall. The walls were lined with faded advertisements for long-gone train routes and destinations, a reminder of the station's lost purpose. I glanced up at the clock hanging above the ticket booths, 12:37. It hadn't moved in decades, maybe more. Time had stood still here, as though it had gotten stuck, just like the station itself. "All right," Cole said, breaking the tension. "Let's see what we can find. The sooner we get out of here, the better, right?" I could feel a knot tighten in my stomach, but I forced myself to nod. "Yeah, let's just keep it together." We split up. Lena and I went toward the old ticket, booths on the left side, Cole and Dev to the platform on the right. I half expected the place to creak under the weight of our steps, but it remained eerily silent. The floorboards gave a little when I stepped on them, groaning underfoot, but nothing else moved. It was strange, this feeling that the building wasn't just old, it was waiting for something, or someone. That's when it happened. The shrill, unmistakable sound of a train whistle echoed through the station. My heart lurched, and I spun around to see if anyone else had heard it. But the others were still moving around, inspecting the ticket counters and the small rooms that lined the walls. No one seemed to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice tight. Lena looked over at me with raised brows. "You mean the whistle?" "Yeah, I heard it too." Her voice sounded confused. "But the tracks aren't even here anymore." I could feel a chill slide down my spine. We had all seen the signs. Outside, torn up tracks, collapsed platforms, there was no way a train could have been anywhere near the station. Not anymore. "Let's keep moving," Dev called from across the room. He was already down the hallway, pulling out his flashlight to inspect a forgotten office tucked into the far corner. There's got to be something cool back there. I didn't know why, but the whistle echoed in my mind as I followed Lena into the ticket booths. There was something about the sound that was wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be heard by living ears. A train wasn't supposed to be blowing its whistle in an abandoned station. I had a feeling that whatever we were about to uncover here was much worse than just a simple ghost story. Lena approached one of the booths, brushing her hand along the dusty counter. "You think anyone still comes here?" she murmured, peering through the cracked glass of the ticket window. Before I could respond, Cole's voice carried from the other end of the room. "Hey, I found something." We both turned, moving quickly toward him. He was kneeling beside a rotting wooden crate, one side of it already falling apart. Inside were a stack of old, yellowed train tickets, each one with a date. October 17th, 1957. The date of the disaster. One ticket, though, caught my eye. It was stained dark red, like someone had spilled blood on it. I felt a shiver crawl up my back, but before I could say anything, Lena spoke. "Guys, there's something off about this place." Her voice was thin, almost like she didn't want to admit it. I could see it too. There was a heaviness hanging in the air, something ancient and wrong. "Let's keep moving," Cole said, standing up, his hand still gripping the red-stained ticket. "We haven't even seen the worst of it yet." I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. Whatever was waiting for us at Black Ridge Station, I wasn't sure. We were ready for it, but we were already in too deep. The deeper we ventured into Black Ridge Station, the more I felt like we were walking through some kind of warped, decaying memory. like the place itself was trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. There were layers of dust in every corner, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rot. But underneath it all, there was something else. Something colder. A chill that refused to leave, no matter how far we wandered. I tried to shake the feeling, off as we walked deeper into the station. Rhea, always the skeptic, had moved toward the abandoned ticket counter, her flashlight dancing over the cracked windows. "This place is like a time capsule," she said, her voice echoing in the silence. "It's like no one's been here in forever." I agreed with her, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like something was off. Maybe it was the way the place felt too still, too empty. Maybe it was the train whistle from earlier that still rang in my ears. Whatever it was, it made my pulse race faster than it should have. "We should check out the offices back there," Cole suggested, breaking the silence. There could be more stuff about that crash, the one that shut this place down. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why. Part of me just wanted to turn around, walk out, and pretend like we'd never come here. But that part of me was getting smaller, the more we moved forward. We crossed the cracked tiles of the main floor and headed toward the hallway that led to the offices at the back of the station. The flickering of our flashlights was the only sound, and it seemed to make the shadows stretch longer, darker. The walls were lined with old black and white photos of passengers from another time, smiling families, businessmen with bowler hats, young women holding bouquets. They were all staring out at us, their faces frozen in that moment, but their eyes looked wrong. Too sharp, too knowing. "God, this place feels like it's alive," Dev muttered, stopping beside one of the photos. His voice was low, almost reverent. Rhea snorted from the other side of the hallway. "You're being dramatic, it's just a creepy old station." But I wasn't so sure. Every time I looked at one of those photographs, I felt like I was being watched, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Cole was standing by a dusty old filing cabinet, his eyes scanning through some paperwork, when he suddenly stopped. His body stiffened, and I could see the blood drain from his face. "You guys need to see this," he said, his voice tight. Rhea and I rushed over. Cole had opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of yellowed papers, some of them ripped at the edges. The papers were old train tickets, but what caught my attention was the date stamped on the top, October 17th, 1957. I knew the significance immediately. That was the day of the crash, the day the station had been closed down, forever. "Wait," Lena said, suddenly looking down at a single ticket. She bent closer, her flashlight illuminating the paper. The edges of the ticket were stained a dark, sickly red. It was almost too dark to be just rust or dirt. The red looked fresh. "What the hell is that?" Dev asked, his voice barely a whisper as he stepped closer. I don't know." Lena pulled the ticket out, her fingers trembling slightly. "But I think this is connected to the crash. This ticket could belong to one of the passengers." Suddenly, the entire room felt colder, like the air had thickened with something heavy and unnatural. I noticed my own breath had become visible in the dim light. It wasn't cold enough for that to happen, not in this part of the station, but still, there it was. A coldness that made me want to hurry, to get the hell out of here before we found something we couldn't undo. But we didn't leave. Not yet. Rhea set her flashlight on the ground and moved deeper into the office. "This place is way worse than I thought," she said, her voice echoing as she wandered around. Her flashlight flicked over a row of old suitcases, most of them battered and covered in mold. She kneeled down to open one. "Jesus, look at these." Inside one of the suitcases was a bundle of old clothes, a few books, and something that looked like it had been hastily stuffed into the bottom. It was a photograph, faded with age, of a man in a conductor's uniform, but his eyes. I couldn't place it at first, but they were wrong. They weren't like the eyes of the passengers in the other pictures. They were too sharp. His grin stretched too wide, too unnaturally, like something that shouldn't have been human. Rhea turned the photo over and gasped. The back of the photo had something written on it in a dark ink. "He waits for you." I stepped back, my throat going dry. The words felt like a warning, like something trying to reach out to us from the past, to drag us deeper into whatever nightmare Blackridge Station had become. "Okay, that's enough," Lena said, her voice shaking. "We should go. Now." But before anyone could move, we heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from deeper within the station. They echoed down the hall even though none of us were walking. No one was behind us. Lena froze. "What the hell?" I grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." But something stopped me. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It wasn't the cold air, or the strange tickets, or the photograph with the weird grin. It was the whistle. The same one I'd heard earlier. It was louder now, closer. A train's whistle. And this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the station. The walls trembled, the floorboards creaked, and the sound of the whistle grew louder still, drowning out all other noise. As I looked back toward the tracks, I saw the faint outline of a train's headlamp, blinking through the dark tunnel, its light flickering in the distance like a promise. A promise of what? I couldn't tell. But I knew it wasn't anything good. "Let's go," I screamed, grabbing Cole's arm. But as we turned toward the exit, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing at the far end of the platform. His face was pale, his features obscured in the dim light, but his eyes, they were glowing. His grin stretched too wide, impossibly wide. The conductor. "All aboard," he whispered, his voice carrying like the wind. And then, the train whistle screamed louder as if calling us to board. Panic hit me like a jolt of electricity, but it wasn't enough to make my legs move fast enough. My heart pounded in my chest, hammering against my ribs as if it wanted to escape my body and sprint out of Blackridge Station for me. I grabbed Lena's arm with a vice grip, pulling her toward the exit. I could hear her breathing raggedly beside me, but I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down, because I knew that something wrong was behind us. The sound of the whistle had grown deafening, the air around us vibrating with its low, mournful blast. It was like the whole station had come alive, groaning and creaking in protest. The floors beneath us trembled with each step, and I swear I could feel the weight of something moving, something ancient, lurking just beyond the reach of our flashlights. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating us, and the distant hiss of steam grew louder, closer. I glanced behind us for the first time, but I didn't see anything at first. The platform was empty, just the worn-down, rusted rails stretching into the dark tunnel. But that was when I saw it, the faint flicker of a light in the tunnel's mouth, dim at first, then gradually growing brighter. A headlamp. The train was coming. "No, no, no, no," I screamed, pulling harder on Lena, who was still struggling to keep up. My pulse was a sharp staccato in my ears as I dragged her toward the exit. We had to get out. We had to leave. But with every step we took, the darkness behind us seemed to stretch further, swallowing the light from our flashlights, blocking the exit like a wall. "Lena, come on," I yelled again, nearly losing my balance as I tugged her forward. Rhea, too, was still behind us, her face pale as she pushed herself forward. "I can't. Oh my God, look at that," she shouted. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what she was seeing, but I couldn't help myself. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse of what she was pointing at. The figure, the conductor. He was standing at the far end of the platform, exactly where we had seen him in the photograph. But now he wasn't just in a picture. He was real, too real. His pale, gaunt face was illuminated by the flickering lights of the station, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle, eyes wide and hollow, gleaming in the dark. His mouth was stretched into a grin that could only be described as inhuman. It wasn't a smile. It was a grotesque rictus of something old, something evil. I felt my stomach twist in horror as his eyes met mine, and I could swear he was staring directly into my soul. "All aboard. Go, go, go," I screamed. turning away from him and yanking Lena with me. But it was too late. The sound of the train's whistle blasted again, louder this time, like a final warning. The pressure in the air thickened, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. The train was right there, just ahead, its massive form slowly materializing from the darkness, steam hissing from its engines as it crept toward us like a monster coming from some far-off nightmare. "Get to the door," Lena screamed. We finally reached the exit, but it wasn't open like I expected. The doors, the same ones we had pried open just hours ago, were now sealed shut. We couldn't get out. My mind raced. There had to be another way. There had to be. But before I could think, a deafening crash came from behind us. The sound of metal grinding against metal, of the train's wheels screeching against the tracks. The entire building shook with the force of it. "Please, please, let us out," Cole screamed, pounding on the door. But there was nothing. No sound except the train's relentless approach, the ominous hiss of steam, the sound of something crawling just behind us. I turned toward the back of the station, toward the tunnel where the light was growing brighter, the shadowy figure of the conductor looming closer. It was like the air itself was solidifying, pressing in on us, and I felt a cold, wet pressure at the back of my throat. Like the ocean had risen up beneath the station, like we were sinking, drowning in the very place we had been foolish enough to explore. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. I was frantic now, pushing harder, shoving with all my might. It felt like the walls were breathing, pulling in and out with each thud of my fists against the wood. The floor beneath us groaned, shaking harder now, and the smell of smoke and burning rubber filled the air. "Move!" Rhea shouted, pushing past me. She grabbed the metal handle of the door and twisted it with surprising force, and it gave way. For a split second I thought we might escape, but then before we could get through, a voice low, guttural, "All aboard." It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. The kind of promise you make when you've already claimed something, someone, us. And then, the train's whistle pierced the air again. I felt it before I saw it. The train had arrived. The platform vibrated with its presence, the walls shaking with the sound of its arrival. There were no windows, but I could hear the clatter of metal wheels as the train came to a slow stop. A hiss of steam rising from the engines like the breath of something alive, something hungry. A thick mist began to fill the platform, creeping up from the tracks and swirling around us. I could feel its cold tendrils closing in, pressing against my skin, crawling into my lungs. My head spun as the train's headlamp grew brighter, almost blinding until I could see nothing but its oppressive light. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, the doors of the train opened. Empty. But it didn't matter, because I could feel it. Something was waiting for us. We had no choice but to step forward, to get on. I could hear Lena's breath hitch, but there was no escape. The train waited for no one. I forced myself to step toward it, and then I heard the scream, a voice, Rhea's voice cut through the mist. I turned just in time to see her stumble, her foot caught in the tracks. She fell hard, face first into the dirt. A cold hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned and found myself face to face with the conductor. "You're late," he whispered, and then the world went black. The cold air felt suffocating, like I was breathing in seawater instead of oxygen. Every breath was a labor, my chest tight, my body moving like it was trapped in thick mud. Rhea's scream echoed in my ears, a high-pitched, desperate cry that sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to look back to help her, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that if I stopped, I'd never move again. I could hear the shuffle of feet, the rustle of clothing behind me, but I didn't dare glance over my shoulder. The feeling of the hand on my shoulder was still there, cold and clammy, as if I'd been touched by death itself. It sent a wave of terror through my body, making my spine stiffen. The conductor, the man from the photographs, was there. His hand on my shoulder felt too heavy, too cold. I could feel the dead weight of it like it belonged to something that was never truly alive. The train's wheels, grinding against the tracks, filled the air with an unholy sound. Like a massive animal was stirring in its slumber, preparing to wake. I wanted to scream, wanted to break free, but I couldn't. My body was locked in place, The train before me was enormous, its metallic body gleaming despite the rust creeping along its edges. The engines, black and swollen with age, hissed and groaned, the steam rising like some kind of ghostly vapor, blocking out the last of the dim light in the station. "No. No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. Lena and Cole were beside me now, their eyes wide with terror. I could see their mouths moving, but no sound came from them. They were frozen too, like statues carved from stone, as if the very presence of the train had drained them of their ability to speak. The man, the conductor, stood right in front of me now, his pale face stretched into that horrific grin. The air around him felt thick with the scent of something burnt, something rotten. His uniform was old, frayed at the edges, as though it hadn't seen a proper wash in decades. But still, he stood tall and unwavering, his black eyes locked onto mine. "You missed the last one," he said, his voice low and raspy like he hadn't spoken in years. His jaw seemed to unhinge slightly as he spoke, as if his words were being dragged out of him by some unseen force. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you mean, the last one?" I asked, my voice cracking, my words barely more than a whisper. "The final departure," he repeated, each word slipping from his mouth like a death sentence. "The train takes the lost souls, those who should have never left." He took a step forward, his cold hand still pressed on my shoulder, like a weight I couldn't escape. Behind me, I could hear the unmistakable sound of something scraping along the platform. I turned briefly, just enough to see what it was, and my stomach lurched. The mist that had been swirling around the platform began to take shape, coalescing into something far darker. I could see silhouettes, figures, people standing in the fog, their faces hidden but their presence undeniable. I could feel their eyes on me, feel their cold gaze piercing through my flesh. The sound of the train's whistle blared again, deafening and sharp, filling the air with an urgency that cut through everything else. "The final departure is never late," the conductor continued, his smile stretching impossibly wide now. "But you all were. You'll join the others, the ones who missed their chance." I wanted to fight back, to tear myself away from the nightmare that was unfolding in front of me. But the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. My legs were weak, my body was moving slower, like the train's very presence was draining me. I tried to speak again, but no words came. I could see the others beside me now, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. We were all being pulled toward the train, drawn to it by some invisible force, like helpless insects to a flame. I could see the shadows moving closer, the figures in the mist coming forward, their outlines becoming clearer, more defined. The scraping sound grew louder. It sounded like footsteps, hundreds of them. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway of one of the train cars. At first, it seemed like just another shadow, another lost soul trying to board. But as I looked closer, my heart skipped a beat. The figure was wearing a conductor's uniform, just like the one on the man standing in front of me. But this one was different. It was more worn, more decayed, like it had been sitting in a tomb for years. Its eyes were wide open, black as coal, staring straight through me. It raised a hand and pointed directly at me. The breath left my chest. The force of it took my voice away, made my entire body feel weightless, like I was floating. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to do anything. Lena's voice cut through the haze of my thoughts. "We need to get out of here, now," she screamed, grabbing at my arm. Her grip was strong, but there was something frantic in her voice, something that made me realize that we still had a chance. But the conductor was moving toward us now. His steps were slow, deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. The other figures had stopped advancing, watching us from the shadows. The temperature had dropped drastically, and I could see the breath coming from my mouth in sharp clouds. The cold was unbearable, seeping deep into my bones. Suddenly, the ground beneath us shifted again. The platform lurched, and I stumbled, nearly falling into the gap between the tracks. The train's headlamp shone brighter, brighter than I thought possible. It was blinding now, forcing me to shield. My eyes with my arm. Not yet. The voice was softer this time, almost like a whisper, but the words sent a chill down my spine. Lena and I made a break for it, bolting for the platform's edge, with Cole right behind us. My body moved on instinct now, fueled only by terror, by the sheer desperation to escape whatever this place had become. The conductor's words echoed in my mind, relentless, like a drumbeat. The final departure. Just as we reached the edge, I glanced back one last time. The train was right behind us now, the whistle deafening. Its doors were open, the darkened interior beckoning us like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. The conductor, still standing on the platform, his smile stretched wider than it should have been, his hand still raised, beckoning. I didn't look back after that. I didn't look back until I felt the wind against my face, until I saw the trees of Blackridge Station behind us, the thick fog clearing in the distance. The station was behind us now, but the whisper still echoed in my mind. The final departure had come, and we hadn't escaped. Not completely. Not yet. We didn't speak as we stumbled through the woods, the damp earth beneath our boots, slick with dew, and the crushing weight of what had just happened. Rhea was ahead of me, still holding her breath, her face pale and tight with fear. Lena kept close, her hand clutching mine so hard I thought my fingers might snap. Cole was at the back, looking over his shoulder constantly, his eyes darting, like a man trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. We were free. Or so we thought. The wind picked up as we neared the edge of the woods, cutting through the trees like a living thing. I could still hear the sound of the train's whistle in my head, that sickening shriek that had lodged itself there, a constant reminder of the horrors we'd witnessed. But the deeper I walked, the more the fog seemed to close in around me. I glanced at the others, saw the same fear reflected in their eyes that had seen things no one should ever have to. The finality of it all pressed down on me, like an invisible weight I couldn't shake. The train, the man, the final departure. I couldn't let go of it. I couldn't let go of what I knew was still there, waiting. The trees began to thin, and a distant, eerie silence settled over us. The woods had swallowed up the sounds of our steps. I felt like we were in some kind of limbo, the boundary between life and whatever we had narrowly escaped. The station was gone, but someone was still with us. Do you hear that? Rhea's voice broke through the silence, and I stopped in my tracks. I strained my ears. At first I couldn't place it, but then it hit me. The sound of a train. No, I spun around, my breath catching. The woods were empty. There was nothing behind us but the dense, dark forest. No tracks, no sign of the train that had haunted us. But the sound of its whistle echoed in my ears, clearer now. Louder. It's impossible, Lena whispered, shaking her head. It can't be. But I knew it was real. I could feel it, deep inside, like it was tethered to me, pulling me back. Rhea, the one who had been the most terrified, was suddenly quiet. Her head turned, her eyes widening as she slowly looked behind us. I followed her gaze, my heart in my throat. There, in the distance, emerging from the trees, was the outline of something unmistakable. The headlamp first, then the heavy black silhouette of a train that shouldn't be there. It was materializing right before us, as if the earth itself was parting to make way for it. The trackless ghost train. Run, Cole said, his voice hoarse, barely audible. Run! But it was too late. The train's whistle grew louder, sharper, and before any of us could take another step, the train was already here. The ground beneath our feet trembled as if the earth had been cracked, but the blackened carriages loomed over us like a nightmare made flesh, and standing there at the door of the train was the conductor. His face was worse than I remembered. It had rotted, decayed more since we'd last seen him. His once pristine uniform now hung from his skeletal frame, torn in places, stained with something dark, something that wasn't just dirt. The same grin stretched wide, but now it was stretched too thin, too impossibly wide. His hollow eyes gleamed in the pale light of the train's lamps. You can't run from it, he rasped, his voice reverberating in the air like a death knell. The final departure always finds its passengers. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like some invisible force had rooted me to the spot. I glanced at the others. They were frozen too, but something was different. They weren't just afraid anymore. They were lost, their eyes wide with realization. They understood. There was no escape from this. The train wasn't a place we could outrun. It wasn't something we could avoid or forget. It was already inside us. The conductor stepped forward, his long fingers reaching out like they were made of shadow, a hand so pale it almost seemed to glow in the dim light of the train. "We've all been waiting," he said, his voice now a rasp, barely more than a whisper. "And now you'll come with us. There is no going back." I fought the instinct to run. I tried to scream, to break free of the invisible hold he had over me, but my voice caught. The sound of the train's whistle, the final departure, ripped through my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then I saw it. Behind the conductor, in the darkened windows of the train cars, I saw them. Dozens of faces, some familiar, some strange. People who had vanished long ago, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretched in silent screams. The lost souls of the station, the passengers. I wanted to look away. I wanted to deny it all, to convince myself that this was some hallucination, that this was just another nightmare. But I couldn't. I knew deep down that what I was seeing was real. There was no escaping Blackridge Station. The conductor stepped forward and gently pulled me toward the train. His grip was icy, his fingers like frozen steel. As I was pulled into the darkness of the train, the others followed one by one, their faces blank with resignation. They had all seen the truth now. There was no escaping the final departure. We were part of it now, and as the train doors slammed shut behind, so I heard the whistle one last time, long, mournful, and final. There would be no more departures after this one.